She traveled 1,400 miles to marry a man who took one look at her body and chose someone else. But the woman they called the bride no man wanted would become the only reason an entire valley survived the worst blizzard in 40 years. They laughed at her size. They whispered behind her back. They said she'd never last a single winter on the frontier. They were wrong about everything. This is the story of Miriam Calder. And if you stay until the end, you'll never forget her name. Like this video, leave a comment with the city you're watching from so I can see how far her story has traveled. And let's begin. The train shuddered to a halt at the end of the line. Not a grand station, not even a proper platform. Just a strip of warped timber nailed across two barrels, a faded sign reading Ash Hollow, and letters the wind had nearly scrubbed clean, and beyond it, nothing. Nothing but a sweep of brown grassland rolling toward mountains that looked like the jagged spine of some ancient sleeping beast. Miriam Calder stood in the doorway of the rail car, her fingers white-knuckled around the handle of a single suitcase. The leather was cracked, the brass clasp held together with a twist of wire she'd bent herself somewhere outside of Omaha. Everything she owned fit inside it. A cotton dress. 2 aprons. Her mother's herb journal, wrapped in oilcloth. A pair of woolen stockings that had been darned so many times the original thread was just a memory. And the letter. The letter from Percival Doone, written in careful blue ink on merchant stationery, promising her a home, a marriage, a life. Come west, Miriam. I have built something here. I need a woman of substance beside me. A woman of substance. She had read those words so many times during the long journey that they lived behind her eyelids, appearing every time she blinked. She had whispered them to herself in crowded way stations and dirty boarding houses, on rattling coaches and riverboats that smelled of mule and tobacco. She had carried those words like a lantern through the darkness of 2,000 miles of uncertainty. She stepped down from the train. The wind hit her immediately, dry, sharp, carrying grit that stung the skin of her cheeks and lodged in the creases of her neck. Her dress, a dark blue cotton that had been respectable when she left Philadelphia, was now wrinkled and travel-stained, and the wind pressed it against her body, outlining every curve, every generous line, every inch of the figure she had spent 28 years learning to carry without apology. Miriam was not a small woman. She had never been a small woman. Her shoulders were broad, her arms thick and capable, her waist wide, her face round and full beneath dark hair she kept pinned in a practical knot. She moved with the deliberate steadiness of a person who understood gravity, who had learned early that the world would try to make her feel heavy in ways that had nothing to do with weight. She scanned the platform. A handful of people milled about. A man unloading feed sacks from a wagon. 2 women in bonnets whispering to each other near the general store across the mud street. A boy chasing a dog between the hitching posts. But no Percival. No tall, fair-haired merchant with kind eyes and a careful smile, the way he'd described himself in his letters. Instead, a young man approached, thin, nervous, wearing a clerk's apron and spectacles that sat crooked on his nose. "Ma'am, would you be Miss Calder?" "I am." The clerk swallowed. His eyes darted to her suitcase, then to her face, then away, as if looking at her directly was something he couldn't manage. My name is Edwin? Edwin Pace. I work for Mr. Doone, at the dry goods store. Where is Percival? The question was simple, direct, but Edwin flinched as though she'd struck him. Mr. Doone asked me to come in his place, ma'am. He wanted me to tell you that. Edwin pulled a folded paper from his apron pocket, opened it, and read aloud in a voice that cracked on every other word. He wanted me to tell you that circumstances have changed, that he entered into a marriage 3 weeks ago to Miss Caroline Bliss, and that he regrets any inconvenience and wishes you well. The words landed like stones dropped into still water. Miriam did not move, did not blink. The wind pulled at her skirt, and somewhere behind her the train gave a long, low whistle, preparing to leave. He regrets, she repeated quietly, any inconvenience. Edwin's face was scarlet. Yes, ma'am. He wanted me to give you this. He held out an envelope. It's money for a return ticket and a little extra for your trouble. Miriam looked at the envelope. She looked at Edwin's trembling hand. She looked past him, across the mud street, to where two women in bonnets had stopped whispering and were now openly staring. One of them covered her mouth, the other smiled. A thin, cruel, knowing smile. And Miriam understood. They all knew. The whole town knew. Percival had sent this boy to deliver humiliation in public, on a platform, where everyone could watch the fat woman from the east receive the news that she had been replaced by someone slimmer, younger, wealthier, someone more suitable, someone who looked the way a merchant's wife was supposed to look. "Ma'am?" Edwin's voice was barely a whisper. "The money? Put it away. Ma'am, he really does want you to—" "I said put it away." Edwin withdrew his hand as though the envelope had caught fire. He stared at her, bewildered. Miriam picked up her suitcase. She adjusted the collar of her dress. She squared her shoulders, those broad, strong, working woman shoulders, and she walked forward, past Edwin, past the staring women, past the boy and his dog, and the man with his feed sacks. She walked with her chin level and her back straight, and she did not hurry, and she did not look down, and she did not cry. Behind her, one of the women in bonnet said something she was meant to hear. "Well, I suppose even a mail-order bride has to meet certain standards." Laughter, light, musical, vicious. Miriam kept walking. She did not know where she was going. She had no money for a room. She had no return ticket. She had no one in this town, no contact, no friend, no plan beyond the promise of a man who had broken it before she'd even arrived. But she kept walking because standing still on that platform would have meant accepting that they were right about her, that she was something to be pitied, something to be sent back, something that did not belong. And Miriam Calder had decided a long time ago that she would never accept that. She found the bench outside the telegraph office and sat down. Not because she was tired, though she was, bone deep, the kind of tiredness that comes from weeks of travel and months of hope, but because she needed to think. The town of Ash Hollow spread before her in the afternoon light. It was smaller than she'd expected, a single main street of packed dirt, rutted by wagon wheels, lined on both sides with buildings that looked like they'd been hammered together in a hurry and never quite finished. A general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the east, as though the wind had been pushing at it for years. Beyond the buildings, the land opened up, vast, brown, endless, interrupted only by the dark lines of fences and the occasional smudge of a distant homestead. This was supposed to be her home. She opened her suitcase and took out her mother's herb journal. It was small, leather-bound, the pages yellowed and soft from years of handling. Her mother had kept it for decades, filling it with recipes, remedies, notes on plants and their properties, sketches of leaves and roots, instructions for tinctures and poultices, and the strong healing broths that had kept their family alive through 2 outbreaks of fever and a winter so cold the Delaware River froze solid enough to drive a cart across. Miriam's mother had been a large woman too, and she had taught Miriam the only lesson that mattered. Your body is not an apology. It is the house you were built to live in. Fill it with useful things, and no one can evict you from your own worth. Pardon me. Miriam looked up. A man stood in front of her, blocking the sun. He was tall, unusually tall, with the kind of lean, weathered frame that came from years of working land that didn't want to be worked. His face was brown from sun, lined around the eyes, with a jaw that looked like it had been set in place by someone who intended it never to move. His hat was battered. His boots were caked with dried mud. His hands hung at his sides like tools he wasn't sure what to do with when they weren't holding reins or fence wire. He looked at Miriam with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not pity, not amusement. Something closer to recognition, as though he had seen something in her that reminded him of something in himself. "You're the woman Dune sent for," he said. It was not a question. "I was. I saw what happened at the platform. Half the town saw what happened at the platform. I expect so." He shifted his weight. "My name's Silas Rourke. I have a ranch about 4 miles north, a place called Blackthorn." Miriam waited. "I need a cook," Silas said, "and a housekeeper. Someone who can manage a kitchen, keep a house from falling apart, and put meals on the table for 2 men who've forgotten how to take care of themselves." "2 men?" "Myself and my father, Orrin. He's—" Silas paused. Something moved across his face. Pain held tight. He's old, and he's given up. My mother passed a year ago, and he decided to go with her. He won't eat, barely speaks, sits in his room in the dark, and waits to die." The words came out flat, matter of fact, the way a man speaks when he's said the same thing to himself so many times it's lost its sharp edges. "I'm sorry," Miriam said. "I don't need sorry. I need someone who can cook." "Can you cook?" "Yes. I mean really cook. Not open tins and boil water. I mean cook. The kind of cooking that makes a man remember he's alive." Miriam looked at him for a long moment. His eyes were gray, steady, tired. "Mr. Rourke," she said, "I have spent the last 3 weeks on trains and coaches and boats, and I have been lied to, humiliated in public, and laughed at by strangers. I have no money, no room, and no prospects. I am not going to pretend I have better options. But I want you to understand something before I answer. I am not desperate. I am stranded. There's a difference. And if you are offering me this work out of pity, I'm not. Then why?" Silas looked at her. Really looked, the way most people in Ash Hollow had refused to. "Because I watched you walk off that platform," he said, "and I've seen men twice your size crumble under half that weight. Whatever you're carrying, ma'am, you know how to carry it. That's what I need at Blackthorn." Miriam closed her mother's journal. She stood. "Show me your kitchen." The road to Blackthorn Ranch wound north through grassland that turned gold in the late afternoon light, then rose into low hills dotted with twisted juniper and the stubborn gray shapes of sagebrush. Silas drove the wagon in silence, handling the reins with the automatic ease of a man who had driven this road 1,000 times and no longer saw it. Miriam sat beside him, her suitcase between her feet, watching the land unfold. It was beautiful in a way that frightened her. Not the lush, contained beauty of Pennsylvania, green hills, neat fences, rivers that ran between tidy banks. This was beauty without mercy. Open skies stretching so wide it made her chest ache, grass that moved like water in the wind, and silence, a vast humming silence that seemed to press against the ears, as though the land itself was listening. "How long have you been at Blackthorn?" she asked. "Born there. My father built the house before I was born. 40 years it's been standing." "And your mother, she ran the kitchen?" "She ran everything." Silas's voice tightened. "The house, the garden, the root cellar, the chickteen hens. She could butcher a hog, stitch a wound, deliver a calf, and have supper on the table by 6. When she died, the house died with her." "And you couldn't—" "I can keep cattle alive, I can mend fences and dig wells and break horses, but I cannot make a house feel like someone lives in it. That was her work, and I never learned it. And now my father is dying in a dark room because the only thing that kept him alive was the smell of her cooking and the sound of her voice, and both of those are gone." He said this without self-pity, without drama, just the plain statement of a man describing a wound he didn't know how to treat. They crested a hill, and Miriam saw it. Blackthorn Ranch sat in a shallow valley where a creek wound between cottonwood trees. The house was large, but larger than she'd expected. 2 stories of weathered timber with a deep porch that wrapped around 3 sides. Behind it, a barn, a smokehouse, a chicken coop, and the bones of what had once been a garden. Everything was gray. Not just the wood, the air around the place seemed drained of color, as though grief had leached the life out of the very soil. The porch steps creaked under Miriam's weight as she climbed them. The front door hung slightly open, and through it came the smell of dust, cold ash, and something sour. The smell of food gone bad, of neglect, of surrender. She stepped inside. The front room was dark, curtains drawn, furniture pushed against the walls, covered in a fine layer of grit. A clock on the mantel had stopped. A woman's shawl hung over the back of a rocking chair, and beneath it, on the seat, lay a pair of reading spectacles, folded carefully, as though their owner had just set them down and would return any moment. Miriam understood. This was a shrine, not to death, but to the inability to move past it. "The kitchen is through there," Silas said from behind her, pointing down a hallway. She found it. It was a large room, the largest in the house, with a cast-iron stove against one wall, a broad wooden table in the center, and shelves lining the walls from floor to ceiling. The shelves were mostly bare. The stove was cold, crusted with old grease. The table was covered with unwashed dishes, tin cans, crumpled paper, and a half-eaten piece of hardtack so old it had fossilized. Miriam set down her suitcase. She removed her traveling jacket. She rolled up her sleeves. "Where's your water?" she asked. "Pump's outside. The well's good." "Flour?" "Should be some in the pantry. Might be weevils." "I'll manage. Where's your father?" Silas pointed to the ceiling. "Upstairs, corner room. He locked the door 3 months ago. I leave food outside it. Most days he doesn't touch it." "What food do you leave?" "Whatever I can manage. Cold biscuits, jerky, tinned beans." Miriam looked at him. "Mr. Rourke, if someone left cold biscuits and tinned beans outside my door, I might lose the will to live too." Something flickered in Silas's eyes. Not quite a smile, but close. "I'll bring in wood," he said. "Get that stove hot." "Yes," Miriam said. "You will." By nightfall, the kitchen was transformed. Miriam had scrubbed every surface. The table, the shelves, the stove, the floor. She had found the flour barrel in the pantry, sifted out the weevils, and set a sponge dough to rise near the stove. She had discovered onions, salt pork, dried beans, and a sad, withered bunch of carrots in the root cellar. And from these unpromising ingredients, she had built a soup. Not just any soup. A soup that started with rendered pork fat sizzling in the bottom of a heavy pot, then onions sliced thin and cooked slow until they turned golden and sweet, then carrots cut into coins, then beans that had been soaking since she'd arrived, then water from the well, cold, clean, tasting of iron and limestone, then salt, pepper, and a careful pinch of dried thyme from her mother's herb journal, wrapped in a scrap of cheesecloth she'd been carrying since Pennsylvania. The smell filled the kitchen first, then it crept down the hallway, then it climbed the stairs. Miriam kneaded dough at the table, her strong hands pushing and folding, the rhythm as steady and ancient as breathing. The cast iron stove radiated heat, and for the first time in what Silas later told her was nearly a year, the house felt warm. He sat at the far end of the table, watching her with an expression somewhere between disbelief and something he wasn't ready to name. "You've been here 4 hours," he said. "Yes?" "The kitchen looks like a different room." "It's the same room. It just needed someone to remind it what it's for." She shaped the dough into a round loaf, scored the top with a knife, and slid it into the oven. Then she ladled soup into 2 bowls, set one in front of Silas, and carried the other upstairs. The hallway on the second floor was dark. She found the corner room by the thin line of lamplight under the door. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again. "Mr. Rourke? My name is Miriam Calder. Your son hired me today. I've made soup, and I'm leaving it here. It's hot, and it's good, and there's fresh bread coming in 20 minutes. I don't expect you to talk to me. I don't expect anything. But I want you to know that this kitchen is alive again, and as long as I'm in it, no one in this house goes hungry." Silence. She set the bowl on the floor beside the door, placed a spoon beside it, and went back downstairs. Silas was eating. Not slowly, not politely. Eating the way a starving man eats, with both hands wrapped around the bowl, his face close to the steam, his eyes closed. He looked up when she entered. "This is—" He stopped, swallowed, started again. "I haven't had anything like this in—" "Eat," Miriam said. "We can talk later." She sat down across from him with her own bowl. They ate in silence, and the kitchen held them in its warmth, and outside the wind pressed against the windows like something trying to get in. 20 minutes later, when Miriam went back upstairs to check, the bowl outside Oren's door was empty. She picked it up, held it against her chest, and allowed herself, just for a moment, just in the darkness of that hallway where no one could see, to close her eyes and breathe. The first week was war. Not against the house, though the house resisted her. Pipes that leaked, a chimney that smoked, a cellar door that had swollen shut and required Miriam to throw her full weight against it 3 times before it surrendered. Not against the land, though the land was hostile in its indifference, the wind constant, the sun brutal, the distances between things measured not in blocks, but in miles. The war was against despair. Oren Rourke did not come out of his room. He accepted the food Miriam left. Every bowl returned empty, every plate scraped clean. But the door stayed locked, and no voice came from behind it. Miriam cooked for him 3 times a day, each meal more elaborate than the last, each one a carefully constructed argument for living. Chicken broth with ginger and honey, corn cakes with butter she'd churned herself from the milk of the one remaining cow, stewed apples with cinnamon, a precious spice she'd found at the bottom of a canister on the top shelf of the pantry, probably untouched, since Oren's wife had placed it there years ago. "You're wasting your time," Silas said one morning, watching her prepare a tray of biscuits and blackberry preserves for his father. "He's made his choice." "He hasn't made a choice," Miriam said, splitting a biscuit and spreading it thick with preserves. "He's been left alone in the dark with nothing but his grief for company. That's not choosing to die. That's forgetting there's a reason not to." "And you think biscuits are going to remind him?" Miriam looked at Silas. When was the last time someone made him something with their hands and brought it to his door? Not out of duty, not because they had to, but because they wanted him to taste something good? Silas didn't answer. "That's what I thought," Miriam said, and carried the tray upstairs. The town was worse. Word traveled fast in Ash Hollow. Faster than wind, faster than weather, faster than any horse. Within days, everyone knew that the rejected mail-order bride was now cooking at Blackthorn Ranch. The story was too delicious not to tell. The fat woman from the east, thrown over by Percival Doone, picked up out of charity by Silas Rourke, playing house in a dying ranch with a grieving old man. The first time Miriam drove the wagon into town for supplies, she felt the stairs like heat. Women in the general store fell silent when she entered. The shopkeeper weighed her flour with exaggerated precision, as if she might eat it before she paid. A rancher's wife named Helen Garrity, a sharp-boned woman with a voice like a saw blade, said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I give her a month. A woman built like that can't haul water, can't chop wood, can't survive a winter out here. Silas is going to end up feeding 2 invalids instead of 1. Miriam placed her purchases on the counter, counted out her coins. Silas had given her a household budget, and she stretched every cent like rubber, and said, without turning around, "Mrs. Garrity, I have hauled my own water since I was 12. I have chopped wood in snowstorms that would make your winters here look like spring rain, and I have cooked meals for families of 8 on half the supplies you have in this store. But I appreciate your concern." She picked up her goods and walked out. Behind her, the store erupted in whispers. But Miriam noticed that the shopkeeper had given her full weight on the flour, and maybe just a little extra. The second week, something changed. It started with a sound. Miriam was in the kitchen at dawn, as she always was. She had claimed the small room behind the kitchen as her own, a narrow space with a cot and a window that looked out toward the creek, and she was mixing dough for the morning bread when she heard it. Footsteps. Not Silas's heavy boots-on-wood tread. These were lighter, slower, tentative, like a man walking on ice and testing every step before he trusted it. The kitchen door opened. Oren Rourke stood in the doorway. He was tall, like his son, but bent, curved at the shoulders, as though he had been carrying something heavy for a very long time, and his body had shaped itself around the burden. His hair was white, wild, uncombed. His clothes hung on him. His eyes, deep set, the same gray as Silas's, were the eyes of a man who had been staring at a wall for so long he'd forgotten what anything else looked like. He said nothing, just stood there, blinking in the warm light of the kitchen, as though he had emerged from underground and wasn't sure the sun was real. Miriam did not stop kneading. She did not make a fuss. She did not say welcome or I'm so glad or any of the things that would have made him retreat. She just said, "There's coffee on the stove. Cups are on the second shelf. Bread will be ready in 30 minutes. Oren looked at her, looked at the stove, where a pot of coffee was gently steaming, looked at the shelves, clean now, organized, the cups hanging from hooks the way Miriam knew, because she'd asked Silas, his wife had once hung them. He crossed the kitchen slowly, took down a cup, and poured himself coffee. His hands shook. The coffee sloshed, and some of it spilled on the counter. He stared at the spill as though it were a personal failure. "I'll get that," Miriam said calmly. "Sit down." Oren sat. They were quiet together for a long time. Miriam kneaded and shaped and baked, and Oren drank his coffee and watched her, and neither of them spoke, and it was enough. It was the beginning of something. Not a conversation, not a friendship, but a truce between a man who had given up and a woman who refused to let him. When Silas came in from the barn and found his father sitting at the kitchen table for the first time in 11 months, he stopped in the doorway and gripped the frame so hard his knuckles went white. Miriam shook her head at him, a tiny, almost imperceptible shake. Don't say anything. Don't make it bigger than he can hold," Silas understood. He sat down, accepted the plate of eggs and bread Miriam placed in front of him, and ate. Oren ate too, slowly, carefully, as though he were remembering how. After breakfast, when Oren had gone back upstairs, not to his locked room, Miriam noticed, but to the window seat at the end of the hallway, where the morning light came in, Silas stood at the sink and stared out the window at nothing. "How did you do that?" he asked quietly. "I didn't do anything. I made coffee and kept my mouth shut. Sometimes that's all a person needs. Permission to come back without having to explain where they've been." Silas turned and looked at her. It was the first time he had looked at her, truly looked at her, without guardedness, without the careful distance he maintained like a fence around himself. For a moment his face was open, and in it Miriam saw something raw and unprotected, gratitude so deep it was almost grief. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me yet," Miriam replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "We've got a long way to go, and your pantry is a disgrace. I need dried sage, more salt, a proper set of knives, and someone to fix that smoke leak in the chimney before I burn this house down by accident." The corner of Silas's mouth twitched. It was not a smile, but it was the closest thing to one that Blackthorn Ranch had seen in a very long time. And in the kitchen, the bread cooled on the rack, and the stove ticked with settling heat. And the house, slowly, reluctantly, like a frozen thing remembering warmth, began to come alive. The days at Blackthorn settled into a rhythm that Miriam built the way she built everything, with her hands, with intention, with the stubborn belief that order could be carved out of chaos if you woke early enough and refused to stop. She rose before dawn, always before dawn. The darkness outside the small window of her room was still absolute when her feet hit the cold floor, and she dressed quickly, layering wool over cotton, pulling her hair into its knot with practiced fingers that didn't need a mirror. By the time the first gray light touched the mountains to the east, the stove was hot, the coffee was made, and the kitchen smelled of whatever she had decided the day required: biscuits or porridge with molasses, or the thick cornmeal pancakes she fried in bacon grease until the edges went crisp and golden. Silas appeared at 6, always the same way, boots already muddy, hat already on, smelling of hay and horses and the cold morning air. He ate standing up at first, shoveling food into his mouth, the way a man does when he's forgotten that eating can be anything other than fuel. But Miriam put a stop to that in the 3rd week. "Sit down," she said, placing a plate of eggs and ham on the table with a firmness that left no room for negotiation. "I've got fences to check before—" "The fences will still be broken in 15 minutes. Sit down and eat like a human being." He sat, and he ate. And somewhere in the quiet minutes between the first bite and the last, something shifted in the way he held his shoulders. A fraction of an inch downward, as though the simple act of sitting at a table with a warm meal in front of him had released a tension he didn't know he was carrying. Oren's progress was slower. He came downstairs most mornings now, drawn by the smell of coffee and bread. But he spoke rarely and never more than a few words. He sat in the same chair each time, the one nearest the stove, the one Miriam had begun to think of as his. And he watched her work with eyes that seemed to be searching for something in the movements of her hands. She understood what he was looking for. His wife had stood in this same kitchen, had used this same stove, had moved through this same space with her own rhythms and habits. Miriam was not trying to replace that woman. She was trying to prove that the kitchen could hold more than one memory. One morning, near the end of the 3rd week, Oren spoke more than 2 words for the first time. Miriam was grinding dried rosemary with a mortar and pestle she'd found in the back of a cupboard, coated in dust so thick it looked like fur. The scent rose sharp and green in the warm kitchen air, and Oren, sitting in his chair with his coffee, suddenly said, "Eleanor used that. Every Sunday, she'd put it on the lamb." Miriam's hand stilled for just a moment. Then she continued grinding. She had good taste. Rosemary and lamb is one of those things that just works. You can't argue with it. She grew it herself, out by the south wall. There was a whole bed of it. Rosemary, thyme, sage, lavender too, but only because she liked the color. "Is any of it still there?" Oren was quiet for a long time. "I don't know. I haven't looked." Miriam set down the mortar. She wiped her hands on her apron. "Would you show me? When you're ready. Not today. If today isn't good. But sometime." Oren looked at her. His eyes were wet, but his jaw was set. The same jaw as Silas's, the same stubborn line. And he nodded once, a slow, deliberate motion, as though he were agreeing to something much larger than a walk to a garden bed. "Sometime," he said. It was 4 days later that he led her outside. The morning was cool, the sky a hard ceramic blue, and Oren walked slowly, leaning on a stick he'd carved from a branch. When Miriam didn't know, but the fact that he'd carved it meant something. It meant he'd picked up a tool. It meant his hands had remembered what they were for. The herb bed was along the south wall of the house, where the stone foundation absorbed the day's heat and released it slowly through the night. It was overgrown, choked with dead grass and the dry skeletons of last year's weeds. But underneath the neglect, Miriam could see it, the woody base of a rosemary plant, still alive, the low spreading mound of thyme, and there, in the corner, the gray-green stalks of sage, dormant but not dead. Not dead at all. "It survived," she said. Oren stared at the bed. His mouth worked, and for a moment Miriam thought he would cry. But he didn't. Instead, he lowered himself to his knees, slowly, painfully, his old joints protesting, and reached out and touched the rosemary with fingers that trembled. "She planted this the year Silas was born," he said. "She said every child needed something growing alongside them, something that would last." Miriam knelt beside him. The ground was cold and hard beneath her knees, and her skirt spread around her like a dark pool, and she didn't care. "Then let's bring it back," she said. "You and me. We'll clear the weeds, feed the soil, and by summer this bed will smell the way it's supposed to." Oren looked at her. "You're a stubborn woman," Miriam called her. "I've been told." Eleanor was stubborn too. Then she and I would have gotten along. The ghost of a smile crossed Oren's face, brief, fragile, like the first crack in ice when the spring thaw begins. It vanished almost immediately, but Miriam saw it, and she held it in her memory the way she held her mother's recipes, carefully, precisely, knowing she would need it later. They worked in the garden for an hour that morning. Not hard work. Oren wasn't strong enough for hard work yet. But the quiet, meditative labor of pulling weeds and turning soil and discovering what had survived beneath the surface. When they came back inside, Oren ate a full breakfast for the first time, and when Silas came in from the barn and saw his father's muddy knees and the dirt under his fingernails, he looked at Miriam across the kitchen with an expression she filed away alongside Oren's smile, because it told her the same thing. Something that had been dying was remembering how to live. But the world outside Blackthorn did not change as easily as the world within it. The trouble came as the form of Cal Jessup, a neighboring rancher who owned the largest spread in the valley and wore his success like a weapon. He was a broad man, not tall, but thick through the chest and arms, with a red face and a voice that carried the way thunder carries. Impossible to ignore, impossible to mistake for anything gentle. He rode onto Blackthorn land on a Tuesday afternoon with two of his hands flanking him like an escort, and he found Miriam in the yard hanging laundry on the line. He didn't dismount. He looked down at her from his horse with the casual contempt of a man who had never been forced to look up at anyone. "So you're the one," he said. "Dunes left over." Miriam pinned a sheet to the line. The wind caught it, and it billowed out behind her like a white sail. "Can I help you, Mr. Jessup?" "I came to talk to Silas." "He's in the north pasture. You're welcome to ride out there." "I'll wait." Jessup crossed his arms over his saddle horn. His eyes traveled over her slowly, deliberately, the way a man appraises livestock. "They're saying in town you've got old Oren eating again. That true?" "He eats, yes." "Must be some powerful cooking to raise a man from the dead." "He wasn't dead, Mr. Jessup. He was grieving. There's a difference." Jessup laughed, a short barking sound that had no warmth in it. "Well, Silas always did have a soft spot for strays." Miriam stopped pinning. She turned and faced him, and though he was on a horse and she was on the ground, something in the way she stood, feet planted, shoulders square, chin level, made the height difference irrelevant. "I'm not a stray," she said. "I'm a hired woman doing hired work on land that is not yours. If you have business with Silas, you can find him, or you can wait here quietly. But if you came to this ranch to insult me, Mr. Jessup, I'll ask you to do it somewhere I can't hear you, because I have laundry to finish and supper to start. And I don't have time for a man with nothing better to do than sit on a horse and talk down to people." The The two ranch hands behind Jessup exchanged a glance. One of them bit the inside of his cheek to keep from smiling. Jessup's red face went redder. "You've got a mouth on you." "I've got a lot of things on me, Mr. Jessup. A mouth is the least of them." He stared at her for a long, charged moment. Then he wheeled his horse and rode toward the north pasture without another word, his two men trailing behind him like ducklings. Miriam went back to the laundry. Her hands were shaking, not from fear. She had learned long ago that men like Jessup fed on fear the way fire fed on air, but from the effort of standing still when every instinct told her to make herself smaller, to shrink, to become the invisible, agreeable, forgettable woman the world wanted her to be. She pinned the last sheet. She smoothed it flat. And then she went inside to start supper, because supper didn't care whether the world respected her. Supper just needed to be made. That evening, after the dishes were washed and Orrin had gone to his window seat upstairs, Silas told Miriam what Jessup had wanted. The rancher had come to make an offer on Blackthorn, a low offer, barely half of what the land was worth, framed as a favor. He'd take the burden of the failing ranch off Silas's hands, let him and his old man move into town, live out their days in a rented room above the feed store. "He's been circling this place like a buzzard for 2 years, Silas said. He was sitting at the kitchen table, turning a tin cup slowly in his hands. "Ever since my mother died and things started going downhill, he knows I'm barely holding on. 300 head of cattle and barely enough hands to work them. Fences falling down faster than I can fix them. Winter coming, and the hay not half put up." "What did you tell him?" "I told him Blackthorn isn't for sale." "Good." Silas looked up. "You say that like it's simple." "It is simple. This is your home. Your father's home. Your mother built that garden out there, and your father just got on his knees in the dirt for the first time in a year to touch the rosemary she planted when you were born. You don't sell that. Not to a man like Jessup. Not to anyone. Simple to say, harder to do when the money runs out and the cattle start dying. Then we make sure the money doesn't run out and the cattle don't die. We." Silas repeated the word as though testing its weight. "You've been here 3 weeks, Miriam." "I've been here 3 weeks, and your father is eating 3 meals a day. Your kitchen is clean, your pantry is stocked, and you just sat through an entire conversation without staring at the wall like you wanted to walk through it. 3 weeks is plenty of time to earn a we, Mr. Rourke." He looked at her for a long moment. The lamplight caught the lines around his eyes, and she saw how deep they were. Not age lines, but exhaustion lines, the kind cut by years of carrying something alone. "Silas," he said quietly. "What?" "Call me Silas. If we're saying we, then you can stop calling me Mr. Rourke. Makes me feel like my father." It was the first time he'd offered her that, and Miriam understood what it cost him. Silas Rourke was not a man who let people close. He had built a wall around himself the way he built fences around his land, post by post, wire by wire, designed to keep things out. Offering his first name was removing a post. "Silas," she said. "All right, but I'm still calling your father Mr. Rourke until he tells me otherwise." "Fair enough." They sat in the kitchen until the lamp burned low, and Miriam told him about Philadelphia, about the row house where she'd grown up, the kitchen that was barely bigger than a closet, the mother who had taught her to cook on a stove that leaked smoke and a budget that leaked worse. She told him about the years after her mother died, cooking for a boarding house where the owner counted every grain of salt and docked her pay for broken dishes. She told him about Percival's letters, how they had arrived like windows opening in a closed room, letting in light and air and the wild, terrifying possibility that her life could be more than what it was. "I wasn't foolish," she said. "I knew what a mail-order arrangement was. I knew he'd never seen me. I knew there was a chance he wouldn't, that I wouldn't be what he expected. But I thought," she paused, "I thought that a man who wrote those things, about wanting a woman of substance, about building something together, I thought a man like that would see past the outside." "He was a fool," Silas said. "Maybe. Or maybe he was just honest about what he wanted, and I was honest about what I hoped he'd want, and those turned out to be different things." "No." Silas's voice was firm in a way she hadn't heard before. "He was a fool. A man who chooses a woman based on whether she fits the picture in his head instead of the life in front of him, that's a fool." My father chose my mother because she could split a cord of wood and laugh while she did it. She wasn't dainty, she wasn't delicate. She was the strongest person I ever knew, and she looked exactly the way a strong person looks, and my father loved every inch of her until the day she died, and every day after. Miriam was quiet. The kitchen clock ticked in the silence, and outside the wind moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like water. "That's a good way to be loved," she said finally. "It's the only way worth anything." The weeks turned and the season tilted toward cold. Miriam stretched the ranch's thin supplies with the ingenuity of a woman who had spent her life making something from almost nothing. She rendered fat for soap and candles. She dried herbs from Eleanor's recovering garden and hung them from the kitchen rafters in fragrant bundles. She mended clothes, patched curtains, and scrubbed the front windows until light poured into rooms that hadn't felt the sun in a year. When the hens started laying again, they had nearly stopped under Silas's distracted care. Miriam bartered eggs in town for sugar, dried fruit, and a set of proper carving knives that made her work in the kitchen twice as fast. The bartering brought her into Ash Hollow regularly, and each trip was a small battle. The whispers hadn't stopped. They had simply changed shape, the way water changes shape around a stone, flowing around her, finding new channels, always moving. Helen Garrity remained the loudest voice. She held court on the porch of the general store most afternoons, surrounded by women who deferred to her the way smaller birds defer to a hawk, and she had opinions about Miriam that she shared with the generous enthusiasm of someone distributing poison and calling it candy. "She's got him wrapped around her finger," Helen said one afternoon, loud enough for Miriam to hear through the open door of the store. Poor Silas, lost his mother, his father half gone, and now he's got this woman planted in his kitchen like she owns the place. Mark my words, she's after the ranch. A woman like that with no prospects and no family? She's not there to cook, she's there to dig in. Miriam emerged from the store carrying a sack of sugar and a block of hard cheese. She looked at Helen. Helen looked back with the defiant expression of a woman who expected either confrontation or submission and was prepared to enjoy either one. "Mrs. Garrity," Miriam said pleasantly, "I notice you spend a great deal of time discussing my situation. If you ever want to come out to Blackthorn and see for yourself how I'm running that kitchen, you're welcome. I'll even feed you. Though I should warn you, my cooking has a tendency to change people's minds, and I'd hate to deprive you of your favorite hobby." One of the women on the porch laughed before she could stop herself. Helen's face tightened like a fist. "I wouldn't set foot in that house," Helen said. "That's a shame. I made apple cake this morning. Your loss, Mrs. Garrity." Miriam loaded her supplies into the wagon and drove home, and if her heart was hammering and her palms were slick on the reins, the women on the porch didn't need to know that. Courage, her mother had taught her, was not the absence of fear. It was the decision that something else mattered more. What mattered more, right now, was Blackthorn. Because the ranch was changing. Slowly, unevenly, the way a landscape changes after rain. Not all at once, but in patches, in small eruptions of green amid the brown. Orrin was spending hours in the garden now, on his knees in the dirt, clearing and planting and talking to the rosemary in a low, continuous murmur that Miriam pretended not to hear. Silas was working the cattle with a focus he hadn't had in months, mending fences and riding the property lines and coming home at dusk tired but not defeated, eating the meals Miriam made with an appetite that was starting to look like something more than hunger. And the kitchen, Miriam's kitchen now, though she would never have said so aloud, had become the living center of the house. The cast iron stove burned steady from dawn to dark. The shelves were full. The table was clean and set for 3 at every meal. Even though Orrin still sometimes ate alone and Silas sometimes came in so late, the food had gone cold. It didn't matter. The table was set. The places were kept. The message was clear. You are expected. You are wanted. There is a place for you here. It was during one of those late suppers, Silas eating reheated stew, while Miriam sat across from him mending a tear in one of Orrin's shirts, that he said something that caught her off guard. "Jessup came by again today." Miriam looked up. "And?" "Same offer. Little lower this time. He knows I'm short on hay for the winter. He knows I lost 6 head to wire cuts last month. He's patient. I'll give him that." Patient like a vulture. Silas almost smiled. He said something else, too. He said I should think about what kind of future I'm building out here with. He stopped. With what? With the people I've surrounded myself with. Miriam set down the shirt. He means me. He means you. And what did you say? Silas met her eyes. I said the people I've surrounded myself with are the reason this ranch is still standing, and if he had a problem with that, he could take it up with my cook, because she's meaner than I am, and she's got better aim with a cast iron skillet. Miriam stared at him, and then she laughed. A real laugh, full and warm, the kind of laugh that fills a room and chases the shadows into corners where they belong. Silas watched her laugh, and something in his face opened like a door that had been stuck for a long time and finally, quietly, swung free. You didn't really say that, she said. I did. The skillet part? Every word. She shook her head, still smiling. You're going to make enemies, Silas. Already have them. Might as well have them for the right reasons. The smile faded slowly from Miriam's face, but the warmth stayed. It stayed in the kitchen. It stayed in the house. And that night, for the first time since she'd arrived at Blackthorn, Miriam lay in her small bed behind the kitchen and felt something she hadn't felt since leaving Philadelphia. Not safety. Safety was a luxury she'd stopped believing in a long time ago. Something harder to name. Something closer to belonging. The sense that the space she occupied in this house, in this kitchen, in this life, was not borrowed or temporary or conditional on being something other than what she was. She was here. She was needed, and she was not going anywhere. October deepened. The grass on the hills turned the color of old bronze, and the cottonwoods along the creek went yellow, then gold, then bare, their branches reaching up into a sky that grew whiter and colder by the day. Miriam watched the sky with the attention of a woman who had learned to read weather the way others read books. Not for pleasure, but for survival. The air smelled different now, sharper, metallic, like iron held close to the tongue. And the wind, which had been constant since she'd arrived, was changing direction, swinging north, carrying a cold that went through wool and cotton and skin and settled in the bones. Winter's coming early, Orrin said one morning. He was standing at the kitchen window, holding his coffee, staring at the mountains to the north. Their peaks, which had been bare granite a week ago, were white now, dusted with snow that crept a little lower each day. How early? Miriam asked. Too early. The hay's not all in. The cattle are still in the upper pasture. And that sky? He pointed with his cup. That's a killing sky. That's the sky my father used to talk about. The kind that comes before the storms that bury valleys. Miriam stood beside him and looked. The sky was not white exactly, and not gray. It was a color without a name. The color of absence, of light being swallowed, of something vast and heavy pressing down from above. How much time do we have? Days. Maybe less. She found Silas in the barn, saddling his horse for the morning ride. When she told him what Orrin had said, he stopped with one hand on the cinch strap and looked at her with an expression she recognized. Not fear. Silas didn't do fear. But the sharp, calculating alertness of a man counting his resources and finding them short. He's right, Silas said. I've been watching that ridge for a week. The snow line's dropping fast. If a real storm hits before I get those cattle down from the upper pasture, I'll lose half the herd. Then get them down. It's a 2-day drive with 3 hands. I've got one, me. What about the men Jessup mentioned? You can't hire anyone? Silas pulled the cinch tight. The horse shifted. Nobody wants to ride for Blackthorn. Jessup's made sure of that. He's been telling every hand in the valley that this ranch is a dead loss, and any man who works for me is wasting his time. Miriam felt something hot climb up her throat. Anger, pure and clean. So he's not just trying to buy you out. He's trying to starve you out. That's the game. And you're just going to let him play it? Silas swung into the saddle. From above, he looked down at her, and for a moment the hardness in his face softened. I'm going to bring those cattle down. Alone, if I have to. I've done it before. Not with a storm coming. Not alone. Then what do you suggest? I suggest you stop being proud and start being smart. Go into town. Ask for help. Not from Jessup, from the others. The small ranchers. The ones who know what it's like to be squeezed. You're not the only one Jessup's been circling, Silas. Offer them something. A share of the hay. First pick of the spring calves. Whatever it takes. He was quiet for a long moment, sitting on his horse in the gray morning light, and Miriam could see the war on his face. The pride of a man who had never asked for anything, fighting against the practical wisdom of a woman who understood that survival was not a solo act. "I'll think about it," he said, and rode out. He didn't ask for help. Miriam learned this 3 days later when he came home at dark with the cattle, all of them, 300 head, driven down from the upper pasture through terrain that would have challenged 3 experienced riders, alone. He was exhausted in a way that went beyond tired. His face was gray, his hands raw, and when he dismounted, his left leg buckled and he grabbed the fence post to keep from falling. "You stubborn, impossible man," Miriam said, taking his arm and pulling it across her shoulders. She bore his weight without flinching, all of it, the full lean of a tall man's body against hers, and walked him to the house. "You could have been killed." "Could have. Wasn't. That's not the point." "What's the point?" "The point is that you have people here who need you alive, and driving 300 cattle down a mountain alone in pre-storm conditions is not the behavior of a man who plans to stay that way." She sat him down at the kitchen table, pulled off his boots, and saw the damage. His left ankle was swollen to twice its normal size, the skin purple and hot to the touch. He had twisted it badly, maybe worse than twisted, somewhere on the mountain, and he had kept riding on it for hours because that was what Silas Rourke did. He kept going. He absorbed the pain and kept going because stopping meant admitting he couldn't do it alone. And admitting he couldn't do it alone meant admitting the ranch was dying. And admitting the ranch was dying meant admitting that everything his mother had built and everything his father had loved was slipping through his fingers like water. Miriam understood all of this without him saying a word. She understood it because she recognized it. The same stubbornness, the same refusal to surrender, the same terrifying willingness to break yourself rather than bend. She had carried it in herself her whole life. She had walked off that train platform with it. She had stood in Helen Garrity's crossfire with it. She had kneaded dough and scrubbed floors and hauled water with it. But she had also learned something that Silas hadn't learned yet. She had learned that strength was not the same as solitude, that carrying everything alone was not courage, that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was set the weight down and let someone else help hold it. She wrapped his ankle with strips torn from an old sheet, packing it with a poultice of comfrey and arnica from her mother's journal. She heated broth and made him drink it. She put blankets around his shoulders and stoked the fire until the kitchen blazed with heat. And then she sat down across from him and said, "You listen to me, Silas Rourke. You are not going to save this ranch by killing yourself. You are not going to honor your mother's memory by driving yourself into the ground. And you are not going to protect your father by leaving him with no one. If a storm comes, and it is coming, we both know it, you need to be standing when it gets here, not broken, not half dead from pride, standing." Silas looked at her across the table. The fire cracked and settled. Outside, the wind had stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the noise, because in the mountains, when the wind stops, it means the air is holding its breath. Something was coming. They both knew it. Orrin knew it too. Miriam could see it in the way he stood at the window the next morning, staring north, his hand tight on the sill, his eyes tracking the wall of cloud that was building along the mountain ridge like an army massing for assault. "When it comes," Orrin said quietly, almost to himself, "it will come fast." Miriam stood beside him and looked at the sky. It was the color of slate now, heavy and low, pressing down on the valley like a lid. The mountains had disappeared. The air was still, perfectly still, and cold. A cold that didn't bite or sting but seeped, slow and patient, into everything it touched. She put her hand on Orrin's arm. "Then we get ready," she said. "Right now. We get ready for whatever's coming, and we don't stop until we're done." Orrin turned and looked at her. His gray eyes, so like his son's, held something that hadn't been there a month ago. Not hope. Hope was too bright a word for a man who had spent a year in the dark. But trust. The quiet, hard-won trust of a man who had watched a stranger walk into his dead wife's kitchen and bring it back to life, and who had decided, without fanfare or declaration, that this stranger was worth believing in. "Tell me what you need," he said. And Miriam did. They worked through the entire day. Miriam moved through the house and the outbuildings with the focused urgency of a woman who understood that preparation was the difference between surviving a disaster and being swallowed by one. She had Oren inventory every scrap of food in the pantry and root cellar while she hauled water from the well in every vessel she could find: buckets, pots, the old copper wash tub, even a ceramic pitcher with a crack down the side that she sealed with candle wax and a prayer to no one in particular. If the pump froze and it would freeze, they would need water. More water than seemed reasonable. More than 3 people could drink in a week. Because water was not just for drinking. Water was for cooking, for cleaning wounds, for melting snow off frozen clothing, for keeping a sick man's lips wet when fever dried them out. Silas, hobbling on his wrapped ankle, brought the horses and the milk cow into the barn and secured the doors. He split what firewood was already cut and stacked it on the porch. Not enough, Miriam noticed. Not nearly enough. But it was what they had. The woodpile that should have been built up over the autumn had been neglected. Another casualty of a ranch running on too few hands and too much grief. "How long can a storm like this last?" Miriam asked Oren as they stacked canned goods on the kitchen counter. Oren set down a jar of preserved tomatoes and looked at her with eyes that held 40 years of mountain winters. "The worst one I remember was in '68, 7 days. Killed 200 head of cattle in this valley alone. 4 people froze to death within a mile of their own front doors because they couldn't see them. 7 days. 7 days, and the snow was higher than the fence posts when it ended." Miriam looked at the woodpile through the kitchen window. Silas was stacking the last of it, working one-handed, his other arm braced against the porch railing to keep weight off his bad ankle. Even from here, she could see the way he moved, stiff, careful, compensating. He was in more pain than he would ever admit. "That's not enough wood for 7 days," she said. "No," Oren agreed. "It's not. What else can we burn?" Oren was quiet for a moment. Then he said carefully, as though the words cost him something, "There's the parlor furniture, the settee, the side tables, the bookshelf. Eleanor's rocking chair is in there too, but—" His voice caught. "We don't burn that." "We won't burn the chair," Miriam said immediately. "But the rest? If it comes to that?" Oren nodded. It was a small nod, tight, controlled. Miriam understood what it meant. Every piece of furniture in that parlor was a piece of Eleanor. Burning it was not just burning wood, it was burning memory. But Oren Rourke had spent nearly a year choosing memory over life, and somewhere in the week since Miriam had arrived, he had begun to make a different choice. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of a bruise, dark purple at the edges, sickly yellow, where the last of the sun tried and failed to break through. The wind came back. Not the steady, constant wind Miriam had grown accustomed to, but something else entirely. A wind that moved in violent gusts, slamming against the house like a fist, then retreating, then slamming again, each time harder, each time colder. The temperature dropped so fast Miriam could feel it in the kitchen, even with the stove burning, a seeping, relentless cold that crept under the door and through the cracks in the window frames and settled on the floor like something alive. Silas came inside at dusk. He stood in the kitchen doorway, and his face told Miriam everything she needed to know before he opened his mouth. "It's here," he said. The first snow came not as flakes, but as a wall. One moment the valley was visible through the window, gray, dim, but visible. And the next moment it was gone, erased, replaced by a solid curtain of white that moved horizontally, driven by a wind that howled with a sound Miriam had never heard before and hoped never to hear again. It was not the whistle or the moan she associated with storms back east. It was a roar, deep, sustained, inhuman, as though the mountains themselves were screaming. Within an hour, the world outside the kitchen window ceased to exist. There was no barn, no fence, no creek, no valley, no sky. There was only white, a white so dense and absolute that staring into it produced a sensation closer to blindness than sight. The snow piled against the windows with a soft, insistent pressure. And when Miriam pressed her hand against the glass, the cold burned. "Nobody's going out there," Silas said from the table, where he sat with his wrapped ankle propped on a stool. His voice was controlled, but Miriam heard what lived underneath it. The rancher's helpless fury at being trapped inside while his livestock and his land took the full force of the storm without him. "Not tonight. Not until it breaks. The animals are in the barn. The barn's solid. My father built it to stand and it'll stand. But if someone goes out in this, they won't come back. The barn's 50 yards from the house. And 50 yards in this is 50 miles. Miriam nodded. She had already made her calculations, already accepted the reality that the next hours, maybe the next days, would be fought entirely within these walls. She looked at the kitchen with tactical eyes. The stove was the only reliable heat source. The fireplace in the front room worked but smoked badly, and in wind this strong the downdraft would make it dangerous. The upstairs rooms would be freezing within hours. "We stay in the kitchen," she said. "All of us. We keep the stove burning, we keep the door to the hallway closed, and we make this room our whole world until the storm passes." Silas started to argue. She could see it forming in his jaw, the instinctive resistance of a man who did not like being told what to do in his own house. But Orrin spoke first. "She's right," the old man said. He was standing at the window, watching the white nothingness with an expression that was not fear, but something closer to respect. "Your mother did the same thing in '68, moved everything into the kitchen, sealed the doors, kept that stove burning for 5 straight days. She said a kitchen was a fortress if you used it right." The words landed on Silas like a hand on the shoulder. His jaw unclenched. He looked at his father, then at Miriam, and the resistance drained out of him. Not because he'd been overruled, but because he'd been reminded of something he'd forgotten. His mother had known. His mother had survived. And the woman standing in his mother's kitchen was cut from the same cloth. "All right," Silas said. "The kitchen." They moved fast. Miriam and Orrin brought down blankets, pillows, and the mattress from Miriam's small room. They dragged them into the kitchen and arranged them along the wall farthest from the stove, close enough for warmth, far enough to avoid sparks. Silas, unable to help carry, positioned himself at the stove and fed it steadily, keeping the fire at the precise level Miriam instructed, hot enough to heat the room and cook on, not so hot that it devoured their limited firewood in hours. By 9 o'clock, the kitchen was a sealed, glowing chamber of warmth in a house that was rapidly becoming as cold as the world outside it. Miriam could hear the wind finding its way through the upper floors, a hollow, moaning sound, like something searching room by room for a way in. The windows upstairs would be frosted solid by now. The water in the basin in the upstairs hallway would be ice by morning. But the kitchen held. Miriam cooked. Not because anyone was hungry. Fear and adrenaline had replaced appetite, but because cooking was what she did when the world turned hostile. It was her answer to everything she couldn't control. She made a thick potato soup from the last of the potatoes, flavored with salt pork and the dried sage from Eleanor's garden, and she served it in heavy ceramic bowls that held the heat the way a good bowl should. Orrin ate slowly, steadily. Silas ate with one eye on the window and one hand on the arm of his chair, as though ready to stand at any moment, though there was nowhere to go and nothing to fight. "Eat," Miriam told him. "Your body needs fuel the same way the stove does. You can't keep it burning on pride." "I'm eating." "You're moving food around the bowl. That's not eating, that's decorating." Orrin made a sound that might have been a laugh. Silas looked at his father, startled. It was the first sound resembling laughter that had come from Orrin in over a year. And then, despite everything, despite the storm and the cold and the fear, the corner of Silas's mouth lifted, and he ate. The night deepened. The storm did not relent. If anything, it intensified. The wind shifting to a higher register, the snow packing against the walls with a pressure Miriam could feel through the timber, a subtle, constant leaning, as though the storm were testing the house's will to remain upright. She fed the stove every 45 minutes, measuring the wood with the careful attention of a woman who understood that each log was a unit of time, a purchased hour of warmth, and that the supply was finite. At midnight, she made her first calculation and didn't like the answer. At the rate they were burning, the stacked firewood on the porch would last 2 days, maybe 2.5 if she stretched it. If the storm lasted longer than that, and Orrin's story of the '68 blizzard said it could, they would need more. She looked at the hallway that led to the parlor. "Not yet," she said to herself, quietly enough that neither man heard. "Not yet." Silas fell asleep in his chair around 1 in the morning, his chin on his chest, his injured ankle still propped on the stool. Orrin settled on the mattress against the wall, pulling a blanket up to his chin, and closed his eyes. Miriam didn't sleep. She sat at the table with her mother's herb journal open in front of her, reading by lamplight, reviewing recipes for poultices and fever teas and the bone-warming broths her mother had marked with a small star. The ones reserved for the worst situations, the ones designed not for pleasure, but for survival. She read, and she listened to the storm, and she kept the fire burning. The second day was worse, not because the storm intensified. It held steady at a level of violence that seemed almost deliberate, almost personal, but because the house began to lose its fight. The cold crept in from every direction, finding gaps Miriam hadn't known existed. The floor near the door was frigid despite the blanket she'd stuffed under it. The window above the sink developed a feathered pattern of frost on the inside of the glass, growing visibly through the morning, delicate and beautiful and deadly. And Silas's ankle was worse, much worse. He woke at dawn with a groan he tried to swallow and couldn't. When Miriam unwrapped the bandage, the swelling had spread past his ankle to his lower leg, the skin tight and shiny, and discolored in a way that made her stomach tighten. She pressed gently with 2 fingers and felt the heat radiating from the joint, a wet, sick heat that meant inflammation was setting in. "Can you move it?" she asked. He tried. His jaw clamped, the muscles in his neck stood out like cords, and the ankle moved perhaps an inch before he stopped, breathing hard through his nose. "It's not broken," he said through gritted teeth. "You don't know that. I've broken bones before. This isn't broken. It's twisted, badly, but not broken. Silas, I need to treat this properly, or the swelling is going to cut off the blood flow to your foot, and then we'll have a problem that soup and stubbornness can't fix." He looked at her, and in his pain-tightened face, she saw something she hadn't seen before: vulnerability. The armor he wore every day, the iron self-sufficiency that he'd built around himself like a second skeleton, was cracking under the simple, unavoidable reality that his body had failed him at the worst possible moment. "What do you need?" he asked. "Cold. Normally I'd use snow, but..." She looked at the window. Going outside was impossible. Then she looked at the window again, at the frost, at the wall of snow packed against the glass from outside. "Oren," she said, "can you open that window? Just an inch, just enough to scrape snow from the outside into a basin." Oren rose from the mattress, crossed to the window, and worked the latch. The window fought him. The frost had sealed it, but he was a man who had built barns and dug wells and survived 40 mountain winters, and old as he was, his hands still knew how to make things move. The window cracked open, and a blast of air so cold it seemed to have physical weight poured into the kitchen. Miriam gasped. Oren reached through the gap, scraped snow from the packed drift outside, and filled the basin she held out. Then he shut the window, and the cold retreated to the corners of the room, and the stove pushed it back. Miriam packed the snow around Silas's ankle, wrapping it in cloth to keep it in place. She mixed a tea from willow bark. She had dried a supply from the trees along the creek, storing it in her mother's oilcloth the way she stored everything, against the day it would be needed. The tea was bitter, and Silas made a face that in any other circumstance would have made her laugh. "Drink it," she said. "It tastes like the inside of a boot. It'll bring the swelling down. Drink it." He drank. By mid-afternoon of the second day, the firewood on the porch was half gone. Miriam stood in the hallway between the kitchen and the parlor, holding a lamp, looking at the furniture, the settee, the side tables, the bookshelf. Still holding a row of books that Eleanor had read and reread, Miriam could see the worn spines, the softened covers, the evidence of hands returning again and again to the same pages. Against the far wall, Eleanor's rocking chair, with the shawl still draped over its back and the reading spectacles still folded on the seat. She had promised Oren they would not burn the chair. She would keep that promise. But the settee, the side tables, the bookshelf, once the books were removed, these were wood, good solid wood, and wood was heat, and heat was life. She heard Oren's footsteps behind her. He stood in the hallway looking past her into the parlor. His face was very still. "It's time?" he asked. "Not yet, but soon. If the storm doesn't break by tomorrow, we'll need it." Oren stepped past her into the parlor. He crossed to the rocking chair, picked up the spectacles from the seat, folded them into his shirt pocket, and lifted the shawl and pressed it against his face. He stood like that for a long moment, breathing in whatever trace of Eleanor remained in the wool. Then he folded the shawl carefully, tucked it under his arm, and turned back to Miriam. "Take what you need," he said. His voice was steady. "She would have burned it all herself to keep us warm. She would have burned the whole house if it meant we survived. We won't need the whole house, just the settee and the tables. Then take them. Together, they carried the settee into the kitchen. Oren held one end, Miriam the other, and they moved through the dark hallway with the careful coordination of two people who had learned, without formal agreement, to trust each other's strength. In the kitchen, Silas watched from his chair as Miriam took the hatchet from beside the stove and began breaking the settee apart. The wood was old and dry, seasoned by decades in a room with a fireplace, and it split cleanly, almost eagerly, as though it had been waiting for this purpose. The fire leaped when she fed it the first pieces. The kitchen blazed with warmth, and for a while, an hour, maybe two, the cold retreated completely, and the room felt almost safe. It was near dusk on the second day when the knocking started. Not the wind. Miriam knew the wind's voice by now, every pitch and pattern, and this was different. This was rhythmic, desperate, human. She looked at Silas. Silas looked at Oren. Oren was already moving toward the front door. "Don't open it," Silas said, trying to stand and failing, his ankle refusing to hold him. "We don't know. Someone is out there," Oren said, and his voice held a firmness that Miriam hadn't heard since his first morning in the kitchen. "Someone is alive and knocking, and we are not the kind of people who leave them out there." He pulled the front door open, and the storm came in. It came in with a force that staggered Oren backward, a horizontal blast of snow and wind that extinguished the hallway lamp and drove needles of ice across every exposed surface. And with the storm came people, two of them, clinging to each other, coated in white from head to foot, so encrusted with snow and ice that they looked less like humans and more like sculptures that had broken free from the landscape and stumbled to the nearest door. Miriam was there in seconds. She grabbed the nearest figure. A woman, she realized, feeling the shape of shoulders and arms beneath the frozen coat, and pulled her inside. Oren seized the second figure, a man, and together they forced the door shut against the wind, slamming it, leaning against it, until the latch caught and the storm was once again on the other side of the wall. In the kitchen, in the light, the figures became people. Miriam recognized them. The woman was Helen Garrity, sharp-boned, sharp-tongued Helen Garrity, who had predicted Miriam's failure from the porch of the general store, who had called her a schemer and a stray and a dozen other things that Miriam had absorbed and filed away in the place where she kept every cruelty ever spoken about her body, her worth, her right to exist. Helen's face was white, not pale, white, the dead white of skin that had lost its blood, the first stage of frostbite. Her lips were blue. Her hands, when Miriam peeled off her gloves, were waxy and stiff. The fingers curled into claws she couldn't straighten. The man was her husband, Thomas. He was in worse shape. His coat was torn, one sleeve shredded, caught on wire, Miriam guessed, a fence somewhere between the Garrity Ranch and Blackthorn. His right hand was bleeding beneath the ice that coated it, the blood frozen in dark streaks across his knuckles. His eyes were open but unfocused, the dull, wandering gaze of a man whose body was shutting down, pulling blood from extremities to core, sacrificing fingers and toes to keep the heart beating. "Get them near the stove," Miriam said, and her voice, calm, clear, commanding, filled the kitchen like a bell. It was a voice she didn't know she had, a voice that came from somewhere deeper than thought, deeper than fear, a place where competence lived alongside urgency, and produced something that sounded, to everyone who heard it, like authority. "Not too close. Not yet. Get blankets. Warm water? Not hot. We warm them slowly or we damage the skin." Oren moved without hesitation, pulling blankets from the mattress, filling a basin with water from the kettle. Water that Miriam tested with her wrist before allowing it near Helen's hands. Silas, unable to stand, pulled himself along the table and cleared a space, dragging dishes aside with his arm, making room. Miriam worked on Helen first. She removed the woman's frozen outer clothes, cutting the coat with a kitchen knife when the buttons wouldn't yield. Beneath it, Helen was shaking, violent, whole-body tremors that rattled her teeth and made her joints knock together like loose hardware. This was good, Miriam knew. Shivering meant the body was still fighting. It was when the shivering stopped that you had to be afraid. "Helen," Miriam said, close to her face, forcing the woman to focus. "Helen, look at me. You're inside. You're warm. You're going to be all right, but I need you to stay awake. Can you do that?" Helen's blue lips moved. The sound that came out was barely human, a thin, cracked whisper, stripped of all the sharpness and authority that Miriam associated with Helen Garrity's voice. The road, we couldn't see. Thomas said Blackthorn was closest. He was right. You're here. You're safe. Don't talk. Just breathe. She wrapped Helen's hands in warm, damp cloths and held them between her own broad, strong, warm hands, the hands that Helen Garrity had mocked by implication every time she'd called Miriam too big, too heavy, too much. Now those hands were the only things standing between Helen's fingers and the kind of frostbite that ended with a bone saw. Thomas was worse. Miriam left Helen with Orrin and turned her attention to the man, and what she found frightened her in a way the storm itself had not. His core temperature had dropped to a level where confusion had set in. He didn't know where he was, didn't recognize his wife's voice, kept trying to stand and walk toward the door, mumbling about horses and a fence and something he'd left outside. "Hold him," Miriam told Silas. And Silas, injured as he was, leaned forward from his chair and put his hands on Thomas Garrity's shoulders and held him in place with a grip that had nothing to do with his ankle and everything to do with the iron in his arms. "Easy," Silas said to the half-conscious man. "Easy, Tom. You're at Blackthorn. You made it." Miriam stripped Thomas's torn coat, his shirt, his undershirt, all of it frozen, stiff, useless. She wrapped him in dry blankets heated beside the stove. She made willow bark tea and held the cup to his lips, tilting it gently, letting the warm liquid slide down his throat in small doses. She checked his hands, his feet, his ears, the places where frostbite took its first and cruelest toll. His right hand was cut but not frozen. His left hand was worse. The fingers were white and rigid, and when she pressed them, the skin didn't blanch in return. It stayed white, stayed hard. "I need more snow," she said to Orrin, "and my herb journal. It's on the table." Orrin brought both. Miriam opened the journal to a page marked with a pressed sprig of lavender. Her mother's remedy for frostbite, a process so specific and so careful that her mother had underlined every instruction twice. She packed Thomas's damaged hand in snow. Counterintuitive, but the journal was clear. Warming frozen tissue too quickly destroyed it. The snow would bring the temperature up slowly, degree by degree, allowing the blood to return without rupturing the fragile vessels beneath the skin. It was past midnight when the knocking came again. This time, Miriam was ready. She was on her feet before the sound fully registered, moving toward the door with a blanket over one arm and the lamp in the other. Orrin was beside her. They opened the door together, bracing against the wind, and 3 more people fell into the hallway. The Dawson family. Ed Dawson, his wife Martha, and their 14-year-old son James. Ed was a small rancher from 2 valleys over and a quiet man who kept to himself and had never, as far as Miriam knew, said a word about her one way or the other. Martha was half-conscious, supported between her husband and her son, and when they got her into the kitchen light, Miriam saw the reason. She had twisted her knee on the ice and the joint was swollen and locked, the leg held straight and rigid, every step agony. "We were trying to make town," Ed said, his voice raw from the wind. "Couldn't see, couldn't find the road. The boys saw your light." He looked at Miriam. He looked at the kitchen. Warm, bright, organized, the stove blazing, 2 other survivors already bundled and being treated. He looked at Miriam again, and his face did something complicated. Surprise and relief, and something that might have been shame, because Ed Dawson had been in the general store the day Helen Garrity had predicted Miriam's failure, and he had said nothing. Not in Miriam's defense, not against hers. He had simply stood there, a silent witness to casual cruelty, and now he was standing in the kitchen of the woman he'd failed to defend, asking her to save his family. Miriam didn't pause, didn't hesitate, didn't let the moment become anything other than what it needed to be. "Get Martha to the stove. James, come here. Let me see your hands. Ed, there's hot soup in the pot. Serve yourself and sit down." She worked through the night. Every hour brought a new demand, a new crisis, a new test. Helen's fingers began to thaw, and the pain hit her like a freight train. She screamed, a sound so raw and animal that young James Dawson pressed his face against his mother's shoulder and covered his ears. Miriam held Helen's hands in the warm cloths and talked to her, steadily, calmly. A river of words designed not to inform, but to anchor, to give the screaming woman something to hold on to besides her pain. I know it hurts. I know. The pain means the blood is coming back, Helen. The pain means your fingers are alive. You're going to keep them, all of them, but you have to let the blood come back, and the blood hurts. And I'm sorry, and I'm right here. Thomas came out of his confusion around 3 in the morning, surfacing into awareness like a man breaking through ice. He looked around the kitchen, at the people, the blankets, the stove, the woman who was commanding it all, and said in a voice that cracked on every syllable, "Where are we?" "Blackthorn," Miriam said. "You're safe. Helen, she's here. She's all right. Rest." Between crises, she cooked. She made broth, the deep restorative bone broth from her mother's journal, the one marked with 2 stars and the notation "for the worst nights." She kept the pot on the back of the stove, constantly warm, and ladled it into cups and bowls for anyone who could hold one. She made corn cakes on the stovetop and spread them with the last of the preserves. She heated water for compresses and mixed willow bark tea in batches, keeping a kettle dedicated to nothing else. Oren worked beside her. He moved through the kitchen with a purpose and precision that astonished Silas, who watched his father from the table with an expression that shifted, hour by hour, from disbelief to wonder. This was not the man who had locked himself in a dark room for a year. This was a man who had remembered who he was. He fetched water and stoked the fire and helped Miriam change bandages on Thomas's hand and held Martha Dawson steady while Miriam examined her wrenched knee. He spoke little, but what he said was practical, useful, and delivered with the quiet authority of a man who had survived decades of frontier life and understood, in his bones, what survival required. At one point, deep in the darkest hour of the night, Miriam stood at the stove stirring broth and felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned. Oren stood behind her holding a cup of coffee. He had made it himself without being asked, and he was offering it to her. "Sit down for 5 minutes," he said. "I'll watch the stove." "I'm fine. You've been on your feet for 16 hours. Sit down, or I'll have Silas order you, and then you'll have to listen. Because he's technically your employer, and I'm just an old man who doesn't have any authority around here." Miriam took the coffee. She sat at the end of the table, in the one empty chair, and for 5 minutes she drank and rested and let the warmth of the cup seep into her aching hands. Around her, the kitchen breathed with the slow, collective rhythm of exhausted people holding on. Helen slept with her bandaged hands on her chest. Thomas dozed against the wall, his color better, his breathing steady. Martha and Ed Dawson sat together on the mattress, their son between them, all 3 of them wrapped in the same blanket, pressed so tightly together that they looked like a single creature. Silas was watching her. He was always watching her, she realized, not with the appraising gaze of the townspeople, not with Jessup's contempt or Helen's judgment, but with something else. Something that looked, in the dim kitchen light, remarkably like awe. "How do you know all this?" he asked quietly. "Know what?" "Everything. The frostbite treatment, the broths, the way you keep people calm. Where does it come from?" Miriam looked down at her coffee. "My mother. She was a cook and a healer, and a woman who never had the luxury of falling apart. She taught me everything she knew, not because she thought I'd need it, but because she thought the world would need someone who had it. She used to say that a woman who can feed people and fix people will never be without a place in this world, no matter what she looks like, no matter what anyone says about her. She was right. She usually was." The storm raged on. Miriam finished her coffee, stood up, and went back to work. Just before dawn, the wind shifted. It didn't stop. It wouldn't stop for another day, but it changed direction, swinging from north to west, and the sound changed with it, dropping from its sustained roar to something lower, something that pulsed and gusted rather than screamed. The snow continued to fall, but lighter now, no longer the horizontal assault of the past 36 hours, but a thick, steady downfall that piled rather than drove. Miriam opened the kitchen window an inch and looked out. She could see shapes, the fence, the corner of the barn, the white, rounded forms of snowdrifts that had reshaped the world into something unrecognizable. The air was still brutally cold, but the killing wind, the wind that turned cold into a weapon, was losing its strength. "It's breaking," Oren said from beside her. He was looking east where the sky showed a thin line of color at the horizon. Not blue, not yet, but a lighter shade of gray that promised blue, the way a held breath promises the exhale that follows. "It's breaking," Miriam agreed. And then Oren did something that stopped the kitchen, something that made Silas grip the edge of the table and Ed Dawson lift his head and young James Dawson stare with the wide eyes of a boy witnessing something he would tell his own children about decades later. Oren picked up a broom that was leaning against the wall. He carried it to the back door, the one that led to the porch and the yard beyond. He opened the door, a crack, then wider, fighting the snow that had drifted against it, and he began to sweep. He swept the snow off the porch, methodically, steadily, stroke by stroke, pushing the white weight aside, clearing a space, making a path. The cold poured through the open door, but Oren didn't stop. He swept with the focused determination of a man who had decided that the storm was over because he said it was over, and he was going to prove it one broom stroke at a time. It was the first physical labor Oren Rourke had done outside the garden in over a year. It was an old man with a broom against a blizzard that had shut down a valley. It was absurd. It was magnificent. And it was the moment that everyone in that kitchen understood, whether they could articulate it or not, that something had changed at Blackthorn Ranch, something that went deeper than the storm and would outlast it. Miriam watched him from the doorway. The cold air hit her face, her neck, the exposed skin of her arms, and she didn't flinch. She watched Oren sweep, and she felt something rise in her chest. Not pride exactly, and not relief, though both were there. Something larger. Something that felt like the answer to a question she had been carrying since the day she stepped off the train in Ash Hollow and walked into a wall of whispers. The question was simple. Did she belong here? She watched Oren sweep the porch clear, and she knew the answer, and the answer was yes. Behind her in the kitchen, Helen Garrity was awake. She was sitting up, her bandaged hands in her lap, watching Miriam with an expression that Miriam had never seen on Helen's face before and would not have believed possible 24 hours ago. It was not an apology. Helen Garrity was not a woman who apologized. But it was acknowledgement. The silent, forced, irreversible acknowledgement of a woman who had built her certainties on sand and watched the tide come in. Nobody spoke. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of Oren's broom and the settling fire and the slow, steady breathing of people who had survived the night. Dawn broke gray and cold over a valley buried in white. The storm had passed, and in the kitchen of Blackthorn Ranch, Miriam Calder stood among the people she had saved, the ones who had mocked her, the ones who had doubted her, the ones who had stood silently while others did both. And she did not gloat, and she did not accuse, and she did not remind them of anything they had said or believed. She ladled broth into bowls and handed them out and told everyone to eat, because there was still a long day ahead, and the work of surviving was not the same as the work of recovering, and both required fuel. She fed them, because that was what she did. It was what she had always done. And now, finally, they understood what it meant. The digging out took 3 days. 3 days of labor so relentless that Miriam would later remember them not as individual hours, but as a single, continuous act of will. A blur of shovels and frozen earth and muscles that screamed for rest and didn't get it. The snow had buried the valley in a white silence so deep that the first morning after the storm, standing on the cleared porch with a cup of coffee steaming in the cold air, Miriam could not see a single fence post, a single path, a single trace of the human world that had existed before the blizzard arrived and erased it. The barn was half buried, the chicken coop had collapsed under the weight of the snow, and Miriam had to crawl on her hands and knees through a gap she dug with a cooking pot. The shovel was somewhere under 4 feet of drift, to reach the hens, which were alive, all of them, huddled together in a feathered knot of indignant survival. She carried them inside 2 at a time, tucking them into her coat against her body, the way a mother carries children, and she set them up in a corner of the kitchen behind a barricade of crates, because the kitchen was still the warmest room in the house, and she was not about to lose 6 good-laying hens to a frozen coop when they had come this far. Silas watched her carry the last hen inside, its head poking from the collar of her coat with an expression of bewildered dignity, and he shook his head. "You've got chickens in the kitchen," he said. "I've had chickens in kitchens before. They'll lay better warm." "Miriam, there are 7 people and 6 chickens in this room." "Then it's a good thing I'm the one doing the cooking, because the chickens would make a terrible job of it." Ed Dawson laughed. It was the first genuine laugh anyone had heard in 3 days, and it moved through the kitchen like sunlight through a crack in a wall, thin but warm, a reminder that warmth still existed. The Garrittys and the Dawsons stayed at Blackthorn for 4 days after the storm. There was nowhere else for them to go. The roads were impassable, the drifts taller than a man on horseback, and even after the sky cleared to a hard, brilliant blue on the third day, the sheer volume of snow made travel impossible. They were stranded together, the woman they had judged and the people who had judged her. And in that close, forced proximity, something happened that no amount of argument or confrontation could have achieved. They saw her, not the version of Miriam they had constructed from gossip and assumption, the desperate, scheming, oversized woman clinging to a dying ranch because she had nowhere better to go. They saw the real woman, the one who rose before anyone else and had coffee ready before the first light touched the windows, the one who rationed food with the precision of a field commander, stretching supplies that should have lasted 2 days into 5 without anyone going hungry, the one who changed the bandages on Helen's frostbitten fingers twice a day, gently, carefully, soaking them in warm herbal water and wrapping them in clean cloth she'd torn from her own petticoat because the bandage supply had run out, the one who made Martha Dawson a knee brace from barrel staves and leather straps, and brewed willow bark tea so bitter that Thomas Garrity said it could strip paint off a barn wall, and made him drink it anyway because his headaches were a sign of lingering cold exposure, and she was not going to let a man die of stubbornness in her kitchen. Helen was the first to break. It happened on the third morning. Miriam was at the stove, making porridge from the last of the oats, stretching them with water and a handful of dried apples to give the thin mixture something approaching substance. Helen sat at the table, her bandaged hands flat on the wood in front of her, watching Miriam stir. Her face was different now. The sharpness was still there, the angular jaw and the narrow eyes, but something had loosened in it, as though the muscles that held her expression in its customary position of judgment had finally, after 72 hours of being sustained by the woman she had ridiculed, given up the effort. "You didn't have to take us in," Helen said. Miriam didn't turn from the stove. "Yes, I did." "No, you didn't. After everything I—" Helen stopped. Her throat worked. The words were there. Miriam could feel them pressing against the silence, but Helen Garrity was not a woman who apologized easily, and the effort of pushing the words past her pride was visible, physical, like watching someone lift something heavier than they could carry. "After everything I said about you," Helen finished, "you had every right to leave us on that porch." Miriam set the spoon down. She turned and faced Helen, and her expression was not triumphant, not vindictive, not even particularly warm. It was steady, honest, the face of a woman who had absorbed cruelty and processed it and come out the other side without letting it change what she was. "Mrs. Garrity, I don't let people freeze because they hurt my feelings. That's not who I am, and I'd rather you know me by what I do than by what you said about me." Helen held her gaze. Her eyes were wet, but her jaw was set. That particular combination of tears and stubbornness that is the hallmark of a proud woman confronting the limits of her pride. "You saved my hands," Helen said. "The way you treated them, the cold packing, the warm water, the herbs. The doctor in town wouldn't have known to do that. My mother taught me." "Your mother taught you well." It was not an apology. But it was acknowledgement, and from Helen Garrity, acknowledgement was worth more than most people's apologies. Miriam accepted it with a nod, turned back to the stove, and served the porridge. Thomas Garrity was quieter about it. He waited until the 4th day when the first path had been dug to the road, and he and Helen were preparing to leave, to approach Miriam in the hallway while she was folding blankets. "Miss Calder." "Mr. Garrity." He stood there, a big, weathered man turning his hat in his hands like a schoolboy, and said, "My wife isn't good at saying what she means, neither am I. But I want you to know, what you did during that storm, I've lived in this valley for 22 years, and I have never seen anyone do what you did, man or woman. And Helen knows it. She'll never say it proper, but she knows." Miriam folded the last blanket. "Then that's enough. If you ever need anything, firewood, supplies, a hand with the ranch, you send word. I mean it." "I'll remember that, Mr. Garrity." He nodded, put on his hat, and walked out into the glaring white world. Helen followed, moving carefully on the icy path, her bandaged hands tucked inside a pair of Miriam's spare gloves because her own had been destroyed. At the end of the path, Helen stopped and looked back at the house. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. But she looked, and the look lasted longer than it needed to, and Miriam understood that something between them had been permanently altered, not into friendship necessarily, but into a respect that would not be retracted. The Dawsons left the same day. Ed shook Miriam's hand at the door, a firm, deliberate handshake, the kind men reserve for people they consider equals. And Martha, still limping on her braced knee, embraced Miriam without a word, pressing her face into Miriam's shoulder and holding on for a long moment before letting go. Young James, 14 and grave, looked at Miriam with the unguarded admiration of a boy who had witnessed something he would measure every future act of courage against. "Thank you, Miss Calder," he said. "You're welcome, James. Take care of your mother's knee, change the brace wrapping every morning, and don't let her walk on it more than she has to for 2 weeks." "Yes, ma'am." They left. The house grew quiet, and for the first time in days, Miriam, Silas, and Orrin were alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of what they had survived. The blankets, the empty bowls, the hatchet still leaning against the wall where Miriam had left it after breaking apart the parlor furniture, the herb journal open on the table to the page on frostbite treatment. Silas sat at the table with his ankle propped up. The swelling had gone down considerably. Miriam's treatment had worked, though he would limp for weeks. And his color was better, and his eyes were clear. He looked around the kitchen slowly, taking in every detail, as though seeing it for the first time. "You know what you did," he said. Miriam was washing dishes. She didn't stop. "I made a lot of soup." "Miriam." She stopped, set the dish down, turned and looked at him. "You saved their lives," he said. "All of them. Helen, Thomas, the Dawsons, my father, me. You held this house together through the worst storm this valley has seen in 30 years. And you did it with a cast iron stove and a book of recipes and 2 hands that never stopped moving. I did what needed doing. Anyone would have. No." Silas's voice was quiet but absolute. "Anyone would not have. I've been ranching this land my whole life, and I have seen storms break strong men. I have seen neighbors turn each other away from their doors. I have seen people with twice our resources and half our problems fold under pressure that you took on without blinking. What you did was not ordinary, and I will not let you stand there and pretend it was." The kitchen was very still. The stove ticked. Outside, snow dripped from the eaves in a slow, steady rhythm. The first thaw, the first sound of the storm loosening its grip. Miriam looked at Silas across the kitchen. His gray eyes held hers without wavering, and in them she saw something she had seen only in fragments before. In the moment he'd offered his first name, in the late-night conversations at this table, in the way he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. She saw it fully now, unguarded, undisguised, and it frightened her and thrilled her in equal measure. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For saying that." He nodded. The moment held for one breath longer. Then Miriam turned back to the dishes, and Silas turned back to his coffee, and Orrin, who had been sitting in his chair by the stove pretending to doze through the entire exchange, allowed himself, behind closed eyes, the smallest of smiles. The weeks that followed the storm reshaped Ash Hollow in ways that no one could have predicted and no one could reverse. It started with the Garrity's. Helen, whose opinion had been the dominant current in the town's social waters for years, did not suddenly become Miriam's champion. That was not Helen's way. But she stopped criticizing her. The silence was thunderous. When women on the general store porch began their customary whispers about that woman at Blackthorn, Helen cut them short with a single sentence that was repeated so many times it achieved the status of local scripture. "That woman kept me from losing my fingers. You can say what you want, but don't say it where I can hear it." The effect was immediate. The whispers didn't stop entirely. Small-town talk is a force of nature, as persistent and undiscriminating as the wind. But they changed character. Where once the gossip had been about Miriam's body, her failed engagement, her presumed desperation, it was now about her competence, her cooking, her knowledge of herbs and remedies. The way she had commanded a room full of frightened, frozen people through the worst night of their lives with nothing but broth and bandages and an unshakable voice. People began to visit Blackthorn, not in crowds, not with ceremony, But steadily, one by one, in the casual, understated way that frontier people approach a new reality, testing it, the way you test ice on a pond, one cautious step at a time. A rancher's wife appeared at the kitchen door with a basket of dried apples and left with a jar of Miriam's fever tea. A homesteader from the eastern end of the valley rode in to ask Miriam's advice about his daughter's persistent cough and rode out with a poultice recipe and strict instructions. The town doctor, an aging, overworked man named Finch, who drank more than he doctored, heard about Miriam's frostbite treatment and appeared one afternoon with his medical bag and a sour expression. "They're saying you treated Garrity's frostbite with snow and warm water," he said, standing in the kitchen doorway, not quite entering, as though stepping fully inside would constitute some kind of professional concession. "I did." "That's an unusual approach." "It's the correct approach. Rapid rewarming damages the tissue. Gradual warming preserves it. My mother learned it from a trapper who'd spent 40 winters in the Adirondacks, and she wrote it down, and I followed her instructions exactly." Dr. Finch looked at her with the particular irritation of a man who has been doing something wrong for years and has just been told so by a woman with no formal training and a recipe book. "Helen Garrity has all 10 fingers," Miriam added mildly. "I'm aware. Just making sure." Finch left without saying anything else, but he came back 2 weeks later with a question about a rash he couldn't identify on a child in town, and Miriam showed him the relevant page in her mother's journal, and they stood side by side at the kitchen table and discussed it like colleagues. And when Finch left the second time, he was carrying a small jar of the salve Miriam had prepared, and the look on his face was no longer irritation, but something closer to grudging, unwilling respect. The ranch itself was recovering. Silas's cattle had survived the storm. All 300 head, sheltered in the valley below the ranch where the terrain broke the worst of the wind. The hay stores were low but sufficient, supplemented now by contributions from Thomas Garrity, who had delivered 3 wagon loads without being asked and refused payment with a gruffness that dared anyone to call it charity. Ed Dawson sent his boy James over twice a week to help with fence repairs, and the boy worked with the silent intensity of a teenager who has found a hero and is determined to deserve her approval. Orrin was transformed. The change had begun before the storm. In the garden, in the kitchen, in the slow, painful process of choosing life over the comfortable numbness of grief. But the storm had accelerated it. The night he had picked up the broom and swept the porch, the night he had worked beside Miriam for hours without rest, had broken something open in him that could not be closed again. He was present now, fully present. He ate 3 meals a day. He worked in the garden every morning, expanding it beyond the herb bed to include a full vegetable plot. Turnips, carrots, winter cabbage, the hardy crops that could survive in mountain soil. He repaired the chicken coop himself, working slowly but steadily, and when Miriam saw him standing back to admire his work with the same expression of quiet satisfaction that she imagined he'd worn 40 years ago when building this ranch for the first time, she had to go inside and press her face into a dish towel until the tightness in her throat released. One evening in late November, with the first heavy frost silvering the windows and the stove burning low and steady, Orrin said something to Miriam that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. They were alone in the kitchen. Silas was in the barn, tending to a horse with a stone bruise. Orrin sat in his chair by the stove, the shawl, Eleanor's shawl, the one he had saved from the parlor, draped over his knees. Miriam was at the table, writing in her own journal, a small notebook she'd begun keeping since arriving at Blackthorn, filled with her own recipes, her own remedies, her own observations about the land and the weather and the particular needs of a household she had come to think of as her own. "Miriam," Orrin said. She looked up. "Yes?" "I want to tell you something, and I want you to listen without arguing, because I'm an old man and I've earned the right to say what I think without being corrected." "All right." Orrin folded his hands over the shawl. His fingers, knobbed, scarred, the hands of a man who had built a life from raw timber and stubborn soil, laced together with a deliberateness that told Miriam he had been preparing these words for a long time. "When Eleanor died," he said, "I decided to go with her. Not quickly, not violently, but I decided that the world without her in it was a world I didn't want to stay in. So I closed the door and I sat in the dark, and I waited. And for 11 months, that's all I did. I waited. And nobody, not Silas, not the neighbors, Not old Finch with his pills and his lectures. Nobody could reach me, because I didn't want to be reached. I wanted to be left alone with my grief, because my grief was the last thing I had that still felt like Eleanor. He paused. The stove settled. A log shifted, sending a brief shower of sparks against the iron grate. And then you came, Orrin continued. And you didn't try to reach me. You didn't lecture me. You didn't tell me it was time to move on, or that Eleanor would have wanted me to live, or any of the other things people say when they don't know what else to say. You just cooked. You made soup and left it at my door, and you didn't knock more than once. And you didn't wait for me to answer. You just left it there. And the soup smelled like something Eleanor would have made, and it tasted like something Eleanor would have made, and I ate it, and for the first time in 11 months, I felt something that wasn't grief. What did you feel? Orrin looked at her with his son's gray eyes, and in them was a clarity that grief had tried to extinguish and failed. Hungry, he said. I felt hungry. And that was when I knew I wasn't ready to die. Because a man who is ready to die doesn't feel hungry. He doesn't smell soup and want more. He doesn't notice that the rosemary smells different from the thyme. He doesn't care. And I cared. You made me care, Miriam. Not by asking me to, by making a soup so good that caring was the only reasonable response. Miriam's vision blurred. She blinked, and the blur became tears, and the tears ran down her round cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. She let them fall because they were earned, and because Orrin was watching her with an expression that said he understood exactly what they meant. Thank you, she whispered. No, Orrin said firmly. That's my line, and I'm not done. He leaned forward in his chair. You came to this valley with nothing. With less than nothing. You came with a broken promise and a suitcase full of holes and every reason in the world to hate this place and everyone in it. And instead of hating, you cooked, you cleaned, you planted herbs in a dead woman's garden. You treated my son's ankle and Helen Garrity's fingers and Martha Dawson's knee. You saved this ranch and everyone who stumbled onto its porch, and you did it without once asking for recognition or praise or even a simple thank you. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was firm, stronger than she expected, and warm from the shawl in the stove. I want you to hear this from someone who knows what he's talking about, Orrin said. You are not the woman Percival Doone rejected. You are the woman he was too blind and too small to deserve. And anyone in this valley who looks at you and sees anything other than exactly what you are, which is the bravest, strongest, most extraordinary person I have met in 71 years of living, is making the same mistake he made, and they will regret it the same way he will. Miriam held his hand. She held it tightly, the way you hold something precious that you're afraid the wind will take, and she cried without shame. And Orrin sat with her and didn't let go, and the kitchen held them both in its warmth the way it had held everything: grief, hope, crisis, survival. Since the first night Miriam had lit the stove and decided that this cold, silent house would live again. When Silas came in from the barn 20 minutes later, he found them sitting together at the table drinking coffee, and his father was telling Miriam about the day he'd met Eleanor, how she'd beaten him at arm wrestling in front of the whole town, and he'd fallen in love before his wrist stopped hurting. And Miriam was laughing, and the kitchen smelled of coffee and bread, and the dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and the house that had been dying for a year was so full of life that it seemed to press against the walls, straining to hold everything it contained. Silas stood in the doorway and watched, and something inside him that had been holding on too tightly for too long finally, quietly, let go. It was the second week of December when Percival Doone rode up to Blackthorn. Miriam was in the yard, feeding the chickens, returned to their rebuilt coop now, though they still regarded the kitchen door with a proprietary expectation that suggested they considered their indoor residency a permanent arrangement. The morning was cold and clear, the sky a deep winter blue, and the snow on the mountains glittered with a brilliance that hurt the eyes. She heard the horse before she saw the rider, and when she looked up and recognized the figure approaching along the cleared road, her hand stilled on the feed bucket, and her spine straightened, and something in her chest went very quiet and very still, the way the air goes still before weather. Percival Doone was exactly as his letters had described him, and nothing like what they had promised. He was tall, fair-haired, with features that were handsome in the way that a well-made piece of furniture is handsome, pleasing to look at, constructed with care, and ultimately interchangeable with 1,000 other pieces of equal quality. He rode a good horse and wore a good coat and dismounted with the practiced ease of a man who had always had good things and considered them his due. He stood in the yard and looked at Miriam, and his expression was a performance she recognized instantly. The careful arrangement of contrition, warmth, and humble sincerity that a certain kind of man assembles when he wants something from a woman he has wronged and expects her to give it to him anyway. "Miriam," he said, "you look well." She said nothing. She waited. "I heard about the storm, what you did here. Everyone in town is talking about it. The Garrity's, the Dawsons, even old Finch is telling people you know more about medicine than he does." He attempted a smile. It was a good smile, the kind of smile that worked on people who didn't know any better. "I always knew you were remarkable. I said so in my letters." "You also said you wanted a woman of substance," Miriam replied. Her voice was level, emotionless. The voice of someone conducting a transaction she intends to conclude quickly. "And then you married Caroline Bliss while I was still on the train." Percival's smile faltered. I made a mistake, Miriam, a terrible mistake. Caroline and it didn't work. She didn't. He searched for words that would make his failure sound like destiny rather than consequence. She wasn't you. No. She was the woman you chose instead of me. I was foolish. I was influenced by appearances, by pressure from people in town who said, "Who said what, Percival?" He stopped. His mouth opened, then closed. He knew what they had said. He knew exactly what they had said because he had listened to them, and he had weighed their words against his promise, and his promise had come up light. "It doesn't matter what they said," he tried. "What matters is that I'm here now. I'm asking for another chance. I know what you're worth, Miriam. The whole town knows. The whole town knows," Miriam repeated slowly. "The whole town. And that's why you're here. Not because you know what I'm worth, because they know. Because the story changed and now I'm the hero instead of the punchline, and you want to stand next to me while the town is watching." The words landed like stones. Percival's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, denial, anger, and finally a naked, uncomfortable recognition that she was right, and that hearing it said aloud in a chicken yard in December was not the triumphant reunion he had imagined during the ride out. "That's not fair," he said weakly. "Fair." Miriam set down the feed bucket. She walked toward him, and though he was taller, though he was standing, and she was approaching, the distance between them seemed to shrink in a way that had nothing to do with physical space. She stopped 3 feet from him and looked up at his handsome, empty face, and she spoke with a clarity that would echo in Ash Hollow for years. "You sent a clerk to reject me on a train platform in front of the whole town. You offered me pity money. You married another woman because she was thinner and richer and more convenient, and you did it without the decency to tell me yourself. And now that your convenient marriage has collapsed, and I have proven my worth to every person you were trying to impress, you ride out here expecting me to be grateful that you've come back." She paused. The wind moved through the yard, lifting a spiral of snow dust between them. "I am not grateful, Percival. I am not flattered, and I am not available, because I learned something in the months since you threw me away, something your letters never taught me and your rejection made possible. I learned that I will never again allow a shallow man to decide whether I am worthy of respect, or love, or belonging. You had your chance and you measured me with the wrong instrument, and that is your loss, not mine." Percival stood in the cold yard, his good coat buttoned against the wind, his handsome face slack with the particular shock of a man who has miscalculated so badly that the ground beneath his assumptions has simply ceased to exist. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Miriam, Go home, Percival." She picked up the feed bucket, turned her back on him, and walked to the coop. She scattered the last of the feed with steady hands. She did not look back. She did not watch him mount his horse. She did not listen for the sound of hooves retreating down the frozen road. But she heard it. She heard every step, growing fainter, growing smaller, until the sound disappeared entirely, absorbed into the vast white silence of the valley. And when it was gone, Miriam stood alone in the yard with the chickens pecking at her boots, and the sun sharp on the snow, and the mountains standing around her like witnesses, and she breathed, one long, slow, deliberate breath. and she felt something release from her chest that had been lodged there since Philadelphia, since the letters, since the train, since the platform. It was the weight of waiting to be chosen. She set it down. She set it down in the snow beside the chicken coop, and she left it there. And she walked back to the house where a stove was burning, and two men were waiting, and a kitchen smelled of bread. And she did not look back at what she had left behind, because it no longer belonged to her. It had never belonged to her. She understood that now. The weight of waiting to be chosen was a burden she had picked up as a girl and carried across 2,000 miles of hope and heartbreak, and it had never been hers to carry. She was not a woman who waited to be chosen. She was a woman who chose. She chose to stay. She chose to cook. She chose to heal. She chose to open the door to people who had hurt her and shelter them without conditions. And those choices, her choices, made with her hands and her heart and her broad, strong, capable body, had built something that no man's acceptance or rejection could give her or take away. She climbed the porch steps. She opened the kitchen door. The warmth hit her face like an embrace, and inside, Orrin was sitting in his chair with Eleanor's shawl and a cup of coffee, and Silas was at the table cleaning a bridle, and they both looked up when she entered, and neither of them asked where she had been or who she had been talking to, because they already knew. They had heard the horse, they had seen Percival through the window, and they had stayed inside because they understood that what happened in that yard was Miriam's, and she didn't need anyone to fight it for her. She hung up her coat, she washed her hands. She put the kettle on, and the kitchen received her the way it always did, with warmth, with the smell of herbs and wood smoke, with the quiet, steady certainty that this was where she belonged. The winter settled into Ash Hollow, the way winter always settled into mountain valleys. Slowly at first, then all at once, then with a permanence that made it difficult to remember that the world had ever been anything other than white and cold and still. But inside the kitchen at Blackthorn Ranch, the season passed with a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with the woman who kept the stove burning. December became January. January became February. The days were short and dark, the nights long and bitter, and the wind never fully stopped. It lived in the eaves and the chimney and the gaps between the window frames, a constant whispering presence that Miriam had stopped fighting and started ignoring, the way you ignore a neighbor who talks too much. She cooked. She cleaned. She tended the herb stores and the root cellar and the chickens and the sourdough starter she kept alive on the back of the stove in a ceramic crock that had belonged to Eleanor. She read her mother's journal at night by lamplight, adding her own notes in the margins. Adjustments for altitude, for the drier mountain air, for the particular properties of the water from Blackthorn's well, which was harder than Pennsylvania water, and required different proportions in bread dough and different steeping times for medicinal teas. And she watched Silas. She watched him the way she watched everything, carefully, attentively, with the patient intelligence of a woman who understood that the most important things in life revealed themselves slowly, the way a photograph develops in solution, emerging from blankness into clarity, one shade at a time. She watched him mend fences in the snow, his breath making clouds in the frozen air. She watched him with the horses, the way his hands moved on their necks and flanks, gentle and sure. The hands of a man who understood that strength without tenderness was just force. She watched him at the table in the evenings, reading by lamplight, or whittling small pieces of wood into shapes he never showed anyone, or simply sitting with his coffee and staring into the middle distance with the focused stillness of a man working through something complicated inside himself. She knew what he was working through. She had known for weeks, maybe longer. The awareness sat between them like a fourth presence at the table. Unacknowledged, unaddressed, but as real and as warm as the stove itself. Silas Rourke was falling in love with her. He was falling in love with her in the particular, reluctant, almost resentful way that men fall in love when they have spent years convincing themselves they don't need anyone. He fought it. She could see him fighting it, in the way he pulled back when their hands brushed at the table, in the way he left the room when the conversation turned personal, in the way he called her Miriam now instead of Miss Calder, but still maintained a precise physical distance between them at all times, as though closeness were a frontier he wasn't ready to cross. Miriam didn't push. Pushing was not her way. She had spent a lifetime being pushed aside, pushed out, pushed down, and she had learned that the most powerful thing a person could do was stand still and let the world rearrange itself around the fact of her presence. She stood still, she cooked, she waited. Not passively. Miriam Calder had never done anything passively in her life, but with the active, purposeful patience of a woman who understood that some things could not be hurried without being broken. Orrin, for his part, had no patience at all. The old man had become, over the months since Miriam's arrival, a different person. Not the person he had been before Eleanor's death. That man was gone. And Orrin had accepted his absence with the hard wisdom of a person who understands that grief doesn't return you to who you were, but reshapes you into someone new. The new Orrin was quieter than the old one, slower, more deliberate, but he was present. He was alive. And he was absolutely, transparently, unabashedly invested in the relationship between his son and the woman who had saved them both. He was not subtle about it. "She's making pot roast tonight," Orrin said one February evening, finding Silas in the barn brushing down the horses. "Your mother's recipe. Miriam found it in the back of the pantry, written on an old flour sack. She's been marinating the meat since yesterday." Silas brushed the horse's flank without looking up. "That's nice." "It's more than nice. It's your mother's pot roast. She made it every year on my birthday. Miriam found the recipe, and she's making it for tonight, and she doesn't know it was a birthday recipe. She just thought it looked good, and I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something." "What's that?" Orrin stepped closer. His voice dropped, not to a whisper, but to the low, intense register of a father who has run out of time for his son's stubbornness. "That woman is the best thing that has happened to this family since your mother was alive. She walked into this house when it was dying, and she brought it back to life with nothing but a stove and a book and a pair of hands that never stop. She fed me when I wanted to starve. She treated your ankle when you were too proud to admit it was broken. She sheltered people who had mocked her and healed people who had hurt her, and she did all of it without asking for a single thing in return. And you, my son, who can break a horse and mend a fence and drive 300 cattle down a mountain alone, you cannot find the courage to tell her what anyone with eyes can see." Silas stopped brushing. His hand rested on the horse's side, and the horse, sensing the change in his energy, turned its head and regarded him with the calm, uninvested curiosity of an animal that has no opinion about human romantic difficulties. "It's not about courage," Silas said. "Then what is it about?" "It's about, she came here for a job. I hired her. She works for me. If I say something and she doesn't, then she's trapped. She has nowhere else to go. She'd feel obligated, and I won't do that to her. I won't make her feel like she owes me something she doesn't want to give." Orrin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's the most thoughtful, most considerate, most completely wrong thing you have ever said." "Pa, no. You listen. You think you're protecting her. You think you're being noble. But what you're actually doing is making the same mistake Percival Doone made. You're deciding what she wants without asking her. Doone decided she wasn't good enough. You've decided you're not good enough. And in both cases, a man is standing in the way of what that woman deserves, which is the chance to make her own choice." The barn was quiet except for the horses shifting in their stalls and the wind pressing against the doors. Silas stood with his hand on the horse's flank and his father's words in his ears, and for a long time he didn't move. "When did you get so smart?" he asked finally. "I was always smart. I just spent a year in a dark room pretending I wasn't. Miriam cured me of that, along with everything else." Silas hung the brush on its hook. He stood there, facing the wall, and his shoulders moved in a way that might have been a breath, or might have been something deeper. The physical expression of a decision being made somewhere beneath the level of language. "Not tonight," he said. "Silas, not tonight. She's making your birthday pot roast, and I'm not going to turn it into something about me. Let her have the evening. Let us have the evening. I'll find the right time." Orrin studied his son for a long moment, then nodded once. "Don't wait too long. The right time has a way of becoming the time you missed." He turned and walked back to the house, leaning on his stick, moving through the cold with the careful steadiness of a man who had chosen to keep walking and intended to honor that choice for whatever years remained. The pot roast was extraordinary. Miriam served it on Eleanor's good plates, the one she'd found wrapped in paper at the top of the china cupboard, untouched since the funeral. And when Orrin saw them, His eyes went bright with a grief that was no longer sharp, but smooth, worn by time and healing into something bearable, something almost sweet. She always used these for special occasions, Oren said, running his thumb along the gold rim of the plate. I thought tonight felt special, Miriam said. She set the roast on the table, and the steam rose in a fragrant cloud. Beef slow-cooked with root vegetables and red wine, seasoned with rosemary from the garden. Eleanor's rosemary, the plant that had survived the years of neglect and was now flourishing under Oren's daily attention. I found the recipe on an old flour sack in the pantry. The handwriting was beautiful. That was Eleanor's hand, Oren said. She wrote everything down. Said a recipe that lived only in your head died when you did, but a recipe on paper was immortal. She was right, Miriam said. My mother believed the same thing. That's why she kept her journal, not for herself, for whoever came next. They ate. The three of them, at the table, with the good plates and the good food and the warm stove and the evening pressing dark and cold against the windows, while inside the kitchen blazed with light and life. Oren told stories about Eleanor, real stories now, not the careful, sanitized memories of a grieving man, but the vivid, detailed, sometimes funny recollections of a man who had loved a woman for 40 years and was finally able to talk about her without the talking being an act of pain. He told them about the time Eleanor had chased a bear out of the garden with nothing but a broom and a string of language so colorful that the bear had looked genuinely offended. He told them about the winter she'd delivered twin calves in the barn during a snowstorm while Oren stood by and fainted, and she'd finished the job alone and then revived him with a bucket of cold water and a commentary on his usefulness that he could still quote word for word 3 decades later. Miriam laughed. She laughed until her sides ached, and across the table Silas laughed too. A real laugh, deep and surprised, as though the sound had been stored inside him for so long that its release was a physical event, something that changed the shape of his face and the weight of his body and the very air in the room. They sat together long after the food was gone, talking in the easy, wandering way that people talk when they have passed beyond the stage of getting to know each other and arrived at the stage of simply being together. The lamp burned low. Oren yawned, caught himself, yawned again, and finally stood with the exaggerated reluctance of a man who is enjoying himself and doesn't want to admit he's too old to enjoy himself past 9 o'clock. I'm going up, he said. He crossed to Miriam, bent down, and kissed the top of her head. It was the first time he had done this, the first physical gesture of affection beyond a handshake. And Miriam went very still, and her eyes closed. And when they opened again, they were shining. Good night, Oren, she said. It was the first time she had used his first name. He noticed. He smiled, a real smile, full and wide, the smile of a man who had been given back something he thought he'd lost forever. Good night, Miriam. He went upstairs. His footsteps creaked on the old board, slow and steady, and then a door closed softly, and the kitchen belonged to Miriam and Silas alone. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of everything they had not said over the past months, full of the conversations that had circled the edges of something deeper without ever landing on it, full of the accumulated weight of shared meals and shared crises and the slow, patient work of building trust from the ground up. They sat on opposite sides of the table, the way they always did, and the lamp between them cast their shadows long against the walls, and neither of them spoke for a long time. It was Silas who broke the silence. He did it the way he did everything, directly, without preamble, without the careful staging that a more practiced man might have employed. I need to say something to you, he said. Miriam folded her hands on the table. All right, when I hired you, when I brought you out here, I told you it was because I needed a cook, and that was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. He paused. He was looking at his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, and Miriam could see the effort it took him to keep his eyes down, to resist the frontier man's instinct to armor up, to deflect, to retreat behind practicality and plainness. The whole truth, he continued, is that when I saw you walk off that platform, when I watched you take that hit and keep walking, I recognized something. I recognized someone who knew what it was like to carry everything alone and keep going because stopping wasn't an option. And I thought if someone like that could walk into my house, maybe the house would remember how to stand. He looked up. His gray eyes met hers, and they were unguarded in a way Miriam had never seen. Stripped of the distance he maintained like a second skin, raw and exposed and terrified in the particular way that brave people are terrified when they finally encounter the one thing their courage cannot protect them from. "I was right," he said. "You walked in, and this house remembered how to stand. My father remembered how to live, and I remembered." His voice broke, just slightly, a hairline fracture in the steady tone he had maintained through fires and blizzards and a year of watching his family die by degrees. I remembered what it felt like to want something for myself. Not for the ranch, not for my father, for me. The kitchen was so quiet Miriam could hear the wax melting inside the lamp, a soft, continuous whisper. "Miriam, you did more than save my father. You saved this family. You rebuilt something I was certain grief had destroyed. And I am not good at this. I am not good at saying what I feel, because I have spent my entire life doing what needed to be done and never stopping to ask myself what I wanted. But I'm stopping now, right now. And what I want is to ask you to stay, not as my employee, not as my housekeeper or my cook, as my partner, as my equal, as the person who sits across this table from me every morning and every evening for as long as we're both alive." He reached across the table. His hand lay palm up on the worn wood between them, open, offering, vulnerable. The hand of a man who had spent his life gripping reins and fence wire and axe handles, offered now with nothing in it, asking to be filled. Miriam looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She thought about the train platform in Ash Hollow and the clerk with the envelope, and the laughter of women in bonnets, and the long walk to nowhere that had ended, impossibly, here. At this table, in this kitchen, with this man's hand open in front of her and his heart open behind it. She thought about her mother's words. "Your body is not an apology. It is the house you were built to live in." She had lived in it. She had filled it with useful things. And now someone was not asking to change it or diminish it or look past it. Someone was asking to stand beside it. "I have a condition," she said. Something flickered in Silas's eyes. Not fear, not exactly, but the quick, bracing preparation of a man who has just made himself completely vulnerable and is about to hear the response. "Name it. This house. This kitchen. During the storm when those people came to our door, the Garrity's, the Dawsons, we took them in. We didn't ask who they were or what they'd said about us. We just opened the door. I want this house to always be that house. I want Blackthorn to be the place where people come when they have nowhere else to go. Stranded travelers, struggling families, anyone who needs a meal and a warm place to sit. I want the door to stay open, not sometimes, always." Silas looked at her. The flickering in his eyes resolved into something steady, something that looked, in the lamplight, remarkably like certainty. "That's not a condition," he said. "That's who you already are. I wouldn't ask you to be anything else." Miriam placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, gently, firmly, completely. And the warmth of his grip traveled up her arm and settled in her chest and stayed there. A warmth that had nothing to do with the stove and everything to do with the fact that she had finally, after 28 years and 2,000 miles and a lifetime of being told she was too much, found someone who thought she was exactly enough. They sat like that for a long time, hands joined across the table, saying nothing, because the important things had already been said and the rest could wait for morning. They were married in the spring, not a grand wedding. Neither of them wanted that. A simple ceremony on the porch of Blackthorn Ranch, with the mountains behind them, and Eleanor's garden in full bloom along the south wall, the rosemary thick and fragrant, the lavender coming in purple, the sage spreading in low silver-green waves that caught the afternoon light. Orrin stood beside his son, dressed in a clean shirt and the vest Eleanor had made him years ago, which he had found in the back of the wardrobe and put on without hesitation, because wearing it was no longer an act of grief, but an act of connection, a way of bringing Eleanor into the day, of saying she was present, she was part of this, she would have approved. The town came. Not all of it. Ash Hollow was not a place of universal warmth, and there were still those who held their judgments close and their opinions closer. But enough of the town came. Helen Garrity came, wearing a new pair of gloves, and an expression that dared anyone to comment on the fact that she was attending the wedding of a woman she had once mocked from the general store porch. Thomas Garrity came with her, and he shook Silas's hand and kissed Miriam's cheek with the rough tenderness of a man repaying a debt he knew he could never fully settle. Ed and Martha Dawson came, and their boy James, who was taller now than he'd been in December and carried himself with a quiet confidence that owed more to a week in Miriam's kitchen than to any other experience of his young life. Dr. Finch came, carrying as a wedding gift a proper leather medical bag, used but well-maintained with a brass clasp and his own initials engraved on the handle. "You'll need this more than I will," he said gruffly, pressing it into Miriam's hands. "This valley has been making you its doctor, whether you wanted the job or not. Might as well have the right equipment." "I'm not a doctor," Miriam said. "No, you're better. You listen, you observe, and you don't charge by the visit. The valley's lucky to have you, and I'm old enough and tired enough to admit it without it killing me." Miriam opened the bag. Inside, nestled among the instruments and vials, was a small card. She read it, and her eyes went soft, and she closed the bag and held it against her chest the way she had held the empty soup bowl in the upstairs hallway of this house, months ago, in the dark, when Orrin had eaten for the first time. The card read, "For the healer of Blackthorn, with respect, Harold Finch, M.D." Percival Doone did not come. No one expected him to, and no one mentioned his absence, because Percival Doone had already become what he deserved to become, a footnote. A minor character in a story that had outgrown him completely. A man whose rejection had set something in motion that was now so large and so alive that the rejection itself had shrunk to insignificance, like a stone thrown into a river that was already running too fast to be disturbed. Cal Jessup did not come either, but in the weeks after the wedding, Jessup stopped circling Blackthorn. The reason was simple and had nothing to do with sentiment. The ranch was no longer failing, with Orrin working the garden and the property, with the Garritys and Dawsons sending regular help, with Miriam managing the household economy with the ruthless efficiency of a woman who had learned to stretch a penny until it screamed. Blackthorn was not just surviving, it was growing. The cattle were healthy, the fences were mended, the hay was put up properly for the first time in years. And the kitchen, which had been the dead center of a dying house, was now the living center of a thriving one, producing not just meals but medicines, not just food but community, drawing people in from across the valley the way a fire draws travelers from the cold. Jessup saw the writing on the wall. A ranch with allies was not a ranch he could starve out. A ranch with a woman like Miriam at its center was not a ranch that would crumble under pressure. He rode past Blackthorn one afternoon in late spring, slowing his horse at the fence line, and he saw the garden in bloom and the chickens in the yard and the smoke rising from the kitchen chimney and Miriam on the porch with a book and a cup of coffee, and she looked at him without expression, not with defiance, not with triumph, just the calm, level gaze of a woman sitting on her own porch on her own land. And Jessup tipped his hat once and rode on. It was not an apology, it was not respect, but it was acknowledgement, and from Cal Jessup, acknowledgement was surrender. The seasons turned. Spring became summer. The garden exploded with life, vegetables, herbs, flowers, the full riot of growth that mountain soil produces when it is tended with love and knowledge, and the patient, daily attention of an old man who had rediscovered his reason for getting out of bed. Orrin spent his mornings in the garden and his afternoons in the orchard, the small apple orchard behind the barn, planted by his own grandfather, neglected for years, now slowly returning under Orrin's care. He pruned and grafted and watered and talked to the trees with the same low murmur he used on the rosemary, and by midsummer the first new blossoms appeared, small and white and fragile. And Orrin stood among them and looked up at the sky and breathed. Miriam watched him from the kitchen window, her hands resting on the swell of her belly, just barely visible now. A secret she and Silas had been holding for 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment to share it. The right moment came on a Sunday evening, with the 3 of them at the table and the last of the summer light pouring through the windows and the kitchen smelling of roast chicken and fresh bread and the wild mint Miriam had planted along the creek bank. "We have something to tell you," Silas said, and his voice cracked on the word tell in a way that would have been embarrassing if Orrin hadn't already been crying, because Orrin knew. He had known for a week. He had watched Miriam move differently, eat differently, rest her hand unconsciously on her stomach the way women do when they are carrying something precious. And he had said nothing because some news deserves to be given, not taken. "I know," Oren said, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I know. And Eleanor knows, and I am—" He stopped. The tears came freely now, running down the lined face of a man who had wanted to die and chosen to live, and was now being given the most powerful reason to go on living that the world can offer. "I am so grateful I stayed," he finished. Miriam reached across the table and took his hand. Silas took the other, and the three of them sat together in the kitchen that had saved them, holding on to each other, while the summer evening poured golden through the windows, and the garden bloomed outside and the mountains stood around Blackthorn Ranch like sentinels, ancient and patient and enduring. The years that followed built themselves on the foundation that Miriam had laid during those first months. One meal, one remedy, one act of stubborn, unshakable love at a time. Blackthorn Ranch became what she had demanded it become: the open door. The place where stranded travelers found a hot meal and a bed. The place where struggling families brought their sick children and their broken bones and their fevers and their fears, and left with poultices and teas and the quiet, firm instruction of a woman who knew what she was doing and did not charge for it. Miriam's reputation grew the way her garden grew, steadily, organically, rooted in soil that she had prepared and tended with her own hands. She was not the town doctor. She was not the town healer. She was something harder to define and harder to replace. A woman who fed people when they were hungry and fixed them when they were broken and opened her door when the world was cold and did all of it from a kitchen that smelled of rosemary and bread and the particular warmth that comes from a stove that never goes out. The heavyset woman once mocked as an unwanted bride became the recognized heart of the valley. Not because she demanded recognition, not because she proved anyone wrong, but because she lived her life in a way that made the people around her better. And they noticed, and they remembered, and they came back. Again and again, they came back. To the kitchen, to the table, to the woman who had walked off a train platform carrying one worn suitcase and a broken promise, and had turned them, through nothing but her own fierce, quiet, immovable grace, into a life that no one, least of all the world that had underestimated her, could have predicted. Ash Hollow had mistaken prejudice for judgment. They had looked at Miriam Calder and seen her body, and decided they knew her story. They were wrong. Her story was not the one they told about her on the general store porch. Her story was not the rejected bride, the charity case, the woman too large for the frontier. Her story was the one she wrote herself, one page at a time, in a kitchen that blazed with warmth while the world outside was cold. And the last page of that story, if a story like Miriam's can be said to have a last page, was not an ending at all. It was a table. A long wooden table in a warm kitchen set for more people than lived in the house, because there were always more people coming. There were always more plates to fill. And at the head of that table sat a woman with broad shoulders and strong hands and a round face that held, in every line and curve, the evidence of a life lived fully, without apology, without compromise, without the permission of anyone who had ever tried to make her feel small. She was not small. She had never been small. And the world had finally learned to see her as she was. Not too much, but exactly enough.